Wolf Pact. Dizzy. Summary. Joffrey Baratheon is killed during the riots at King's Landing. In response, Tywin Lannister rides into the heart of the northern camp to strike a deal with Robb Stark. 8 years later, it is time for the young wolf to deliver on the hardest part of the bargain. Notes. POVs will alternate between Robb and Myrcella chapter to chapter. There will likely be an odd interlude with Jaime and / or Cersei's POVs, but no one else. This is also being simultaneously published on fanfiction.net, under the same name. Chapter 1, Prologue, The Pact. Chapter Text. Robb. Robb was grim-faced as he pushed the canvas entrance of his tent aside and emerged into the faint morning light. There were few other early risers, likely most of his men were still sleeping off their revelry from the night before. They had been in high spirits this past week, not that he could blame them. The news of Joffrey's death had not been expected, but for once the shock had been a good one. Robb himself had laughed and raised a flagon in the immediate aftermath of the news. They had the Kingslayer caged and now his bastard son was dead, trampled in riots at the capital. Sansa had been present but unharmed, that is what the letter had read anyway. That was the first letter, hurriedly written and unsigned. It was the second letter that had soured his mood, the letter sealed with a lion and signed by Tywin Lannister himself. He wanted to treat, or so he said. He was coming from the capital and into the heart of Robb's camp to treat with him personally. His lords had been beside themselves with glee, but Robb was more cautious. Wary. He didn't trust them. How could he after everything that had happened? The Lannisters had crippled his brother, put his father's head on a spike and held his sisters captive ever since. Now he was supposed to treat with Lord Lannister himself, the new bastard king's new hand. Robb's own crown was set atop his dark auburn curls, he despised the weight of it but his lords had insisted. He fidgeted with his hands, straightening his doublet and throwing a look of contempt towards the Kingslayer's cage. The man was disheveled and almost entirely unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant knight who had sauntered about Winterfell with a disdainful look adorning his face all that time ago. Robb knew that whatever deal Tywin had for him, it would likely include the Kingslayer's release. Half his lords had told him to put his head on a spike in retaliation for his father. Lord Karstark in particular would love to deal the blow himself after his sons had been slaughtered at the hands of their Lannister prisoner. He had refused then because of his sisters, because he had no idea what they would do to them if he sent them the Kingslayer's head in a box. His mother had begged him already to offer up an exchange. Jaime Lannister for Sansa and Arya. He couldn't do it, not even for his sisters could he afford to release the Kingslayer. He wanted better terms. Justice for his father. Freedom for the North, and peace for its people. He wondered what the price for those terms would be as a shout came up from one of the periphery guards that a party bearing lion sigils was approaching. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as the faint sound of hooves against hardened ground reached his ears. There had been a frost again. Winter was indeed coming, and coming quickly. All Robb wanted now was to be back at Winterfell before the snows took hold, to bundle his family up and never let them leave the north again. He felt a presence at his side and turned his head slightly to see his squire stood at his side. Oliver offered him a weak smile and he did his best to return it. "I've set out a flagon of the good wine, your grace," he informed him, and Robb nodded slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice stiffer than he intended it to be. Oliver didn't seem offended though, he merely clasped his hands in front of him and waited at his side for the banners to come into view. They did in the end, as though in slow motion. Robb swallowed hard as his eyes found the man at the helm of the party. There were only 100 men, Robb's own army could kill them all in minutes. Tywin was putting all his trust in the famed Stark honor, and it was only the thought of how disappointed his father would be in him that was stopping Robb from disregarding it. "I will kill them all." That is what he had promised his mother. Justice for his father. Vengeance some might call it, but Robb lusted for it regardless. Joffrey was dead now. That was what his mother had kept reminding him in her soothing tones the night before when neither of them had been able to sleep. Joffrey was dead. The smug little prick who had murdered his father was dead. That was the main thing. Now they needed the girls back, to lay his father to rest with dignity in the vaults of Winterfell. Robb took another deep breath as Tywin pulled on the reins of his horse, pulling it to a halt before dismounting with the grace of a man half his age. Instinctively Rob drew himself up taller, his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the approaching man. He refused to look afraid. He refused to appear green to this man who had years of experience that he could never hope to match. Rob was no fool. He knew damn well that he was no match for Tywine, but he had to hold his own and broker a deal for the North. Freedom. Independence. Was that really too much to ask for? No one south of the border had any desire to have dealings with them anyway. They didn't understand the northern ways with their favorable weather and their different gods. The south was polished where the north was wild and ever so different. Torren may have knelt to dragons once upon a time, but Rob was stood here now with a crown atop his head, and he refused to kneel to a lion. Robb Stark, king in the north. Tywine greeted him with a slight sneer, his tone almost sounded mocking but Rob could not be sure about it. Lord Lannister, he returned coldly, inclining his head slightly as the man did the same to him. Let us not stand on ceremony and treat one another with false courtesies. I am here to end this ridiculous war and secure the Iron Throne for my grandson, Tywine said. Then let us treat. Rob gestured back towards his tent and Tywine let his cold eyes linger on him for a long moment before he swept past and into the space. Rob exchanged a grim look with Oliver before stamping his way after him. If he had it his way then he would have had his lords present for this, but Tywine had insisted that he would treat with him and him alone. Gods! He hoped he would be able to hold his own against this man. Rob may well despise him and all who bear his name, but that did not mean he was not an intimidating presence that he would be far happier to avoid. I ought to congratulate you, your performance at Whispering Wood was inspired, Tywine drawled as he helped himself to the wine that Oliver had left out on the table. Rob had to bite his tongue to stop from thanking the man. He was irked. This was not how he had imagined this meeting going. I won't bend the knee, he said instead, picking up the flagon that Tywine had just set down, seeing the man's brows raise slightly. I didn't expect you to, Tywine replied after swilling the wine in his cup and drinking a long sip from it. You would be a fool to, the older man continued. You are in an enviable position, young Stark. Even without Joffrey's death you would have been a force to be reckoned with. Again Rob found himself wanting to thank him and he frowned slightly, wishing he wasn't being so complimentary. It was unnerving, and it only served to make Rob suspect that some terms would be laid out that he would be less than satisfied with. I want my father's body brought back to Winterfell with all the dignity your grandson didn't show him, Rob said venomously, and Tywine inclined his head. I want his sword back, the one used to murder him, he continued, and again Tywine inclined his head. I will keep my throne, the North will not be answerable to the southern kingdoms, and neither will the Riverlands, Rob went on, deciding to push his luck, suspicion creeping ever further into him as Tywine again inclined his head. My sisters will be returned to me, he finished, and the North will be left in peace. Fine, Tywine uttered the one word in an utterly bored tone. Now, I will tell you what I want, he continued, and Rob inclined his own head to encourage him to speak. I want aid in dispatching Stannis and Renly, Tywine began. I want an alliance between the North and the Southern Kingdoms. You will aid us should we need it, and in return we will aid you should you need it. We will still supply men to the wall, as it is not just the North it protects. We will have a free trade agreement and keep the same coinage. Rob nodded his head, all of that he could agree with, but he had a feeling that Tywine wasn't finished. You will release Jaime, his eyes bored into him, and Rob stared back for a long moment before he inclined his head. I will release your son when both my sisters are returned to me in this camp, Rob told him, and for the first time the older man looked uneasy. What? Rob snarled, his hand clenching around the stem of his wine cup. Lady Sansa will be returned to you with all haste should our agreement be finalized, Tywine said, but the Lady Arya has been missing from the capital since the death of your father. What do you mean, missing? Rob demanded dangerously, his voice shaking slightly. We have had men scouring the country for her but she has not been found, Tywine explained, but rest assured once we are allied and the agreement known, a substantial reward will be offered for her safe return. I will provide the gold myself. From anyone else it would have sounded like a generous offer of help, but hearing it from him just made Rob want to pull his sword and slit the man's throat. The Kingslayer stays with me until both my sisters are returned to me, Rob told him, his eyes flashing as they met his. Very well, he sighed tiredly, but can I request that he at least be kept according to his status? And what status would that be? Knight of the King's Guard? Or the low-life scum who crippled my brother because he caught him fucking his own sister? Rob asked in a venomous tone, seeing Tywin's expression darken for a moment. That is a disgusting lie dreamt up by Stannis Baratheon because he wants to usurp his own nephew's rightful claim to the throne. Do you understand me? His tone was quiet, but Rob could hear the threat in it well enough. Even so, he refused to answer, or even incline his head the slightest fraction. And to prove that the free and independent North does not believe such filth, you will take my granddaughter as your queen. Tywin snapped, and Rob's eyes widened to such a degree that he imagined they might fall out of his head. I am already betrothed to the daughter of Walder Free, he told him. Never before had he been grateful to his mother for making that deal, but he was thanking her over and over in his head now. Walder Free, Tywin chuckled dismissively. I will throw enough gold at Walder Free that he may well drown in it. You will be released from your betrothal to his charming daughter, and you will marry Myrcella when she comes of age. That is my price for your independence, Stark. Now what do you say? Agree to the match and end this war, return to the North a hero and a king, or continue on with it and risk your own life, the life of your sisters and your entire family, and send thousands of your men to a death which you could have saved them from? What's it to be, Stark? Rob said nothing, raising his wine cup to his lips as his heart pounded wildly in his chest. How could he agree to this? Agree to marry a girl who was the bastard product of incest, who was being dressed up as a royal princess? A free girl was one thing, but this. Tywin was eyeing him, though he said nothing else as Rob's head and heart raced unbearably quickly. What choice did he have? How could he live with sending thousands of men to their graves, leaving their wives widows and their children without a father? How could he do that when the end of the war was standing right in front of him? How could he do that when one word of agreement from him would end this now and have them on their way home to Winterfell within a fortnight? He closed his eyes in despair. Myrcella Baratheon was a child. He barely remembered her from Winterfell, only a vague memory of her being there in the stands watching when Bran and Tommen had sparred together. He didn't remember ever speaking to her, or ever looking at her. She was a child. Gods! If he agreed to this, he would be waiting years for a wedding to a girl who would no doubt spend the entirety of those years being poisoned against him and his family by her bitch of a mother. What chance of happiness would they have? He didn't even know if he would be able to tolerate her name, live with the fact that his wife and mother of his children was part of a family he despised. Sister to the tyrant who had ordered the death of his father. But what choice did he have? He would never be able to sleep at night knowing that he had thrown away the chance of peace. Thrown away the one opportunity to get everything he had fought for handed to him. Everything and more, so it seemed. Fine, he uttered the word before he could think any more about it. He had years to get used to the idea of marrying the girl. Years to come to terms with it and think of some way that he could tolerate her, and at least try and live in some kind of harmony with her. Good. Tywin nodded curtly. I will have the terms drawn up if you give me leave to use your tent. Rob could only nod faintly, his head spinning as he thought on what he had just agreed to. The lords would be beside themselves, his mother would be more relieved than he had words for. They were going home. Finally, they were going home, a Lannister queen, the price for safe passage and independence. I'll be out with the men, have my squire send for me when it's done, Rob said faintly as he wandered aimlessly out of the tent, not even waiting for Tywin's agreement. Your Grace, the great Jon hailed him, and Rob looked in his direction to see that all his lords had seemingly gathered in a huddle just waiting for him to emerge. Is it done? Lord Flint asked him, all their eyes wide as they waited for him to relay the news. We have our independence, and a peaceful agreement with the southern kingdoms. They looked speechless as he delivered the news, wide-eyed and doubtless waiting for him to continue. We will aid them in quelling the rebellions from Stannis and Renly, and they will aid us in turn should we ever need it, he went on in a dull tone, and when Princess Myrcella comes of age, I will take her as my queen. If they had been puzzled by his lack of enthusiasm before, then he imagined from the looks on their faces that they understood it well enough now. A Lannister queen, Lord Karstark uttered the words almost like a curse, and Rob sighed heavily. It wasn't negotiable. It was that or continue this war, losing lives unnecessarily. If I can live with it, he took a deep breath and tried to convince himself that that was true. If I can live with it, he repeated, then you almost certainly can. Lord Karstark nodded grimly at his words, the great Yon's hand coming to slap reassuringly against his shoulder. "It could be worse, lad," his hardened general said gruffly, "at least you know you'll be getting a looker." Robb tried to smile, but he would not have been surprised to hear it described as a grimace. His gaze swept over the Lannister party who were being given a wide berth by the slowly wakening camp, his eyes narrowing as they set on the lion sigil fluttering in the breeze. No Joffrey for Queen," one of the Sawins jeered, and again Robb tried to smile. He knew they were trying to cheer him and he was grateful for it, but it was not something he wanted to hear right now. Right now he was quietly mourning his soon-to-be broken betrothal to the Joffrey girl. He had never even had a name for her, let alone a face, but at least he had the comfort of knowing that he wouldn't despise her. "If you'll excuse me, my lords, I need to speak with my mother," he finally said, turning away from them as they murmured their agreements. On his way to his mother's tent he tried to find the words in his mind to break the news to her that Arya was not held at the capital, and had not been for some time. She would be heartbroken, her emotions no doubt as conflicted as Robb's own were right now. All of a sudden he felt selfish for lamenting his new betrothal when his mother would soon be suffering the agony of not knowing where one of her children was. Whether they were alive or dead. He shook his head as he approached. It would do no good to think the worst. If anyone could survive the wilds then it was Arya, he was almost certain of that. He took a calming breath before he called out to his mother, determining to be as positive as possible in her presence. She called for him to come in and he did as she bid him, her eyes looking expectantly at him as he entered. "You have finished treating already?" she asked with wide eyes, and he nodded his head, forcing a smile to his face. "It's good news, mother," he said, "mostly, at least." Her brow creased at that as she stood up and came closer to him, her hand finding his. "Mostly," she repeated, her grip on his hand tightening almost painfully. "Sansa will be returned to us, and father's body. The North will have its independence and a peace with the southern kingdoms," he reeled off, seeing her brow furrow even more. "Arya," her voice was barely more than a whisper and he swallowed hard before answering. "She has not been at the capital since father was killed," he confessed to her, and she gasped, her nails pinching into the back of his hand as her other hand came up to cover her mouth. "Where is she?" she asked almost desperately, but Robb could only shake his head. "I don't know, mother, I wish I did," he said, "but, listen. The Kingslayer will remain our prisoner until she has been found. I will not release him until Arya is back with us. Tywin Lannister is offering a great reward. She will be returned to us, I know it." His tone was fierce by the end and she nodded faintly, her eyes still shining with tears as he looked down on her, inwardly pleading that she would believe him and be reassured. "Tywin Lannister is doing all that," she frowned. "Why? What does he gain from it? He must want more than the Kingslayer's release, Robb. He wants the North to aid him in dealing with Stannis and Renly," he told her, but still she was frowning at him. "There's more," she guessed astutely. "What is it you aren't telling me?" She was suspicious now and sounded almost impatient with him, and so he sighed, knowing he would have to tell her the truth. "I will marry Princess Myrcella when she comes of age," he confessed, seeing the look of dismay cross her features. "The phrase," she tried weakly, and he shook his head. "Tywin has enough gold for them as well," he said bitterly, and she squeezed his hand, her eyes soft and sympathetic. "It is not the worst thing that could have happened," she said, her tone falsely bright. He could only snort in response and her hands came to his upper arms, forcing him to look at her. "It is not," she repeated, her eyes holding his fast. She was always such a sweet and polite girl when she was at Winterfell. She and Tommen were meek and proper, and not at all entitled nor pompous the way Joffrey was. Robb wished he could take comfort from her words, but it was hard for him to see anything other than a bleak future. "Time changes things," he said stonily. "I imagine Cersei Lannister was once a perfectly pleasant young girl. You can bet anything that she will not be endearing her daughter to me. I can't imagine us ever being anything other than miserable. Perhaps we will be able to tolerate one another, if we are lucky. It may not be a love match," his mother soothed him, "but that does not mean it cannot work. I know it will be hard being bound to that family, but you need to have a little faith, Robb. There is no point you thinking the worst of Myrcella before you have spent any time with her. I imagine it will be many years before she is sent from the capital. You have plenty of time to get used to the idea. Perhaps you could write to her." Her suggestion at the end was a hopeful one, and one that had Robb rolling his eyes at her. You really think any letter I write will find its way into her hands? He questioned her, and she sighed heavily. I suppose you may have a point there, she conceded, and he smiled wryly. You think? He raised a brow and she gave him a stern look. You may be a man grown and a king, but that does not mean you can speak to your mother in such a derisive manner, she scolded him, and a real smile twitched his lips. There is no chance of me being corrupted by my own sense of grandeur and entitlement with you around to guide me, mother, he smirked. Perhaps I should assign you a seat on my council. She smacked his shoulder lightly at that, a smile threatening her own lips. Don't cheek me, Rob Stark. Her tone was stern again, but he could hear the underlying amusement and it kept the smile on his lips. Forgive me, mother, I ought to know better at my age, he said, and she smiled, smoothing a crease in his doublet and gazing at him in that searching way that only a mother could. I know you are sacrificing your own personal happiness for the good of this family, Rob, and I swear to you, I will never forget it for as long as I live. You have made your father even prouder today, I know it. Thank you, he nodded, his throat feeling rather constricted as he had to look away from her gaze. You're welcome, she said softly, just as Oliver's voice drifted through the canvas of her tent. That was quick, Rob muttered, and his mother looked at him quizzically as he called to Oliver that he would only be a moment. I have to sign the agreement, he explained to her, and she nodded her head, her cheeks paling. Be sure, she advised him, and he nodded. I am, he tried to sound convincing. I have to be, he shrugged his shoulders before he left the tent, not lingering long enough to allow her to find any more comforting words for him. He walked in silence through the camp with Oliver at his side, seeing his lords give him encouraging nods and weak smiles as he passed by them. He mentally steeled himself before he marched right into his tent, seeing Tywine stood at the head of the table waiting for him. Let's get this over with, Tywine said, holding out a quill to him. Rob stepped forward and took it, turning the parchment so it faced him and reading through each word of it. He heard an impatient huff, but he read on, unwilling to sign anything until he was certain that Tywine was not trying to dupe him. When he reached the end he was grudgingly satisfied. Everything that they had verbally agreed upon was written down, and he knew he had no choice but to sign. Slowly he dipped the quill into the inkpot before moving it to the bottom of the parchment. He swallowed hard before he quickly scrawled his name, handing the quill to Tywine without even looking at him and hearing him scratch out his own mark. I'm sure your squire can add the seals, Tywine said, glancing towards Oliver, who nodded briskly. Of course, my lord, your grace. Oliver bowed shortly to both of them before he moved around the tent to begin melting the wax. Rob watched him for a moment before he fixed his eyes on Tywine. Now what? He asked heavily, and the older man scrutinized him for a long moment. I will see my son, Tywine stated, and then I will return to the capital and arrange for Lady Sansa to be transported here. Rob nodded his agreement at that, watching Oliver dribbling the melted wax onto their signed agreement. I suppose we will have to coordinate, to deal with Stannis and Renly, Rob said grudgingly, and it was Tywine's turn to nod his head. Indeed, he agreed, we will act as swiftly as we possibly can, at least try and make this as painless as possible. Once they are dealt with I will be returning to the north, I hope, with Arya in tow, Rob said, his eyes meeting Tywine's as he spoke. We all want the matter dealt with as soon as possible, he said, that way we need not have any dealings with one another beyond what is necessary. At least, not until it comes time for Myrcella to make her journey north. Indeed, Rob said tersely, watching Oliver carefully rolling up the agreement. Tywine held his hand out for it, but Rob took it before he could, seeing the surprise in the older man's eyes. I will keep this, and have a copy made. We will sign it again when you escort Sansa here, Rob said, and for a second he thought he saw a grudging admiration in the older man's eyes. Very well, he agreed heavily, turning to make his way to the entrance. Until next time. Tywine paused as he pulled back the flap, his eyes looking Rob up and down for a moment. Your Grace. Chapter 2, Winter is Coming. Summary. Set 8 years after the prologue. Notes. Thank you very much to those of you who have left comments and kudos. It is much appreciated. Hope you like the new chapter, and a happy new year to you all. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Myrcella. Myrcella leant her forehead against the windowpane and sighed heavily. Her mother's voice was growing shriller by the second, and it was beginning to give her a headache. They had been going on and on for what felt like hours, and still they hadn't managed to agree on a single thing. She was just about ready to stand up and scream, Perhaps then they would actually remember that she was in the room. That it was her future they were debating. Neither of them would have to journey to the north. Neither of them would have to marry a man who would no doubt despise every fiber of their being. They wouldn't have to be his wife. They would have to bear his children. Bear his coldness. She closed her eyes despairingly. In previous years she had tried to delude herself into believing that it wouldn't be that bad. That he might be soft. Kind. It had been a child's fantasy. The king in the north was a hardened warrior. He had killed more men than she could even comprehend, with his snarling direwolf at his side. She had read all the stories she could get her hands on when the wars were finally done with. When the young wolf had finally returned to Winterfell, his sword sheathed once more. She had pored over them in the dead of night when she was supposed to be sleeping. Her mother would never even utter the name of the man she was promised to. Myrcella knew well enough that she would never tell her anything about him. She craved the knowledge though. She needed to know something of the man that she would be bound to for the rest of her days, or the rest of his. Whichever came first. She lost herself in the words on the pages, let her imagination get caught up in the images that had been so skillfully drawn. The king in the north had become legend already, and he had only just reached 24. He was desired by any woman who laid eyes on him, so Etta had told her in hushed giggles on occasions where Myrcella had fallen into a fit of anxiety over her future. He is the most handsome man, and you are the most beautiful woman. You will be perfect together. Myrcella knew her handmaiden meant well, but she could see it in Etta's eyes that she believed the words no more than Myrcella did. It was something she wanted to be true, not something she ever imagined coming to fruition. Robb Stark was a man. A warrior. A king. A king who despised her family, though Myrcella privately thought that it was not without good reason. She still dreamt of Lord Eddard Stark sometimes. Felt his warm hand on her shoulder, the way his grey eyes had twinkled when he'd looked down on her. She shook her head. Thinking of him only made her long to believe that his son was just as kindly, that he would be just as warm and kind to her. How could he be? After what her family had done. It seemed impossible, and likely it was. Myrcella just prayed that if he could not be kind then at least he would not be cruel. She hoped that one day he might be able to tolerate her, grow to find himself content with their union. Perhaps if she bore him strong children he would soften. The agreement was for Myrcella to go when she reached 8 and 10. Not now, her mother's furious screech pulled her mind from her uncertain future. She turned from the window, seeing her mother and grandfather standing opposite each other, mere feet between them. Her mother's stance was protective, and yet somehow utterly intimidating at the same time. She imagined a lesser man would have quelled. Her grandfather was not that man though. Winter is coming again, her grandfather said calmly, but with unmistakable authority in his voice. If it lasts 6 years as the last did, then Myrcella will not be able to travel. We will have failed on our end of the bargain, and I do not doubt that Stark will jump at the chance to choose an alternative bride, he continued. Good, her mother snapped, and Myrcella untucked her legs from underneath her, swinging them down so they touched the floor. It is not good, Cersei, her grandfather sounded quietly furious now. The North is an independent kingdom, and it is thriving as such. We need to strengthen ties with them, and this is the best way to do it. Myrcella will be queen, and the next king to rule the North will have Lannister blood in their veins. There is no more to be discussed on this matter. Myrcella leaves in 2 days, and that is final. Her mother made an angry noise but threw no retort at her grandfather. He seemed satisfied that there would be no more argument, casting a look towards Myrcella and nodding curtly at her before he turned on his heel and marched from the room. Her mother began muttering furiously at once, but Myrcella was in no mood to try and catch what she was saying. What she really wanted to do was slip from her presence and find Etta. If she really was set to leave for her new life in the North in a mere 2 days, then she would have to begin packing away her things. She swallowed hard. Gods! She was not ready for this. She had thought she had another year here at the capital with her family. With Tommen. She blinked her eyes furiously, refusing to show any upset here in front of her mother. Her tears would only make things worse, cause more arguments. She stood up soundlessly, picking up her skirts slightly before making her way towards the door. Myrcella, her mother's sharp voice stopped her in her tracks, and she took a deep breath before she turned to face her, hoping her expression was neutral. "Yes, mother," she inquired politely, hoping she sounded suitably unaffected. "Sit down," her mother instructed, and she did as she was bid, crossing to take the seat by the fire that was indicated to her. "It seems you are to go to the north sooner than anticipated," her mother told her, as though she had not heard what had transpired mere moments before. "Yes, mother," she said calmly, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "You're not a stupid girl, Myrcella," her mother met her eyes, holding them fast. "You know what Robb Stark is, you know how he feels about the Lannister name." Myrcella held her tongue, deciding it was probably best not to contradict her mother by reminding her that she was named Baratheon. "Yes, mother," she said instead. "He is little more than a savage." Her mother's voice came out as a venomous hiss, "and likely he will treat you little better than a whore. Whatever he forces upon you, you will endure it. You are a lion, do you hear me?" Myrcella merely nodded in response, her mouth suddenly uncomfortably dry. "You will endure him taking his pleasure until he gets you with child," her mother continued. "Perhaps if you bear him a son it will grow easier for you. But hear me now, you must never, ever show him any weakness. No tears. No affection. No affection." Myrcella repeated the words with a slight frown. She was not expecting any affection from her marriage, but surely if it were offered to her then she ought to reciprocate. Surely that could not be wrong. If he thinks you care for him then he has power over you, more power than he will gain from visiting your bed night after night. Her mother said the words scathingly, looking at her as though she were stupid. "Stupid, stupid child. What have I told you?" She shook her head slightly, forcing herself to focus on the present, on her mother's cold gaze. "Of course, mother," she said automatically, digging her fingernails hard into the back of her hand. "Good." Her mother finally looked somewhat satisfied, and Myrcella took a little breath of relief, hoping that she would now be allowed to leave. "May I be excused?" she asked after a moment. "I ought to begin arranging my things." "Yes, go on," her mother said after scrutinizing her intensely for a long moment. "Thank you, mother." Myrcella stood gracefully, dipping into the slightest of curtsies before she again made her way to the door. This time she wasn't called back, and as soon as it closed behind her she picked up her pace and almost ran down the hallways towards her bedchamber. She thought of Tommen on the way, thought of leaving him behind here in this snake's nest. As apprehensive as she was about the north, as frightened as she was about being married, a part of her could not help but be glad that she was finally leaving the capital. She had not done so since the visit to Winterfell all those years ago. She had loved it. Truly loved it. Memories of it flashed before her eyes, and before she could stop herself she was smiling as she remembered Bran and Tommen attempting to spar in the tiltyard. The smile faded from her face as she reached the door to her chamber. Yet another thing the Starks had reason to despise her family for. The north is a frozen wasteland overrun by savages. Joffrey's mocking voice rang in her ears as she let herself into her chamber, firmly closing the door behind her. It was cold in the north, that she could concede, but the people more than made up for it. They were warm. Friendly. They smiled at one another with genuine affection. They were informal. They laughed heartily and did not hold with all the grandeur and the pomp and ceremony that they did here at the capital. At least, that was how it was before. She wondered if it had changed. There had been a war. Then another. Just when they had thought it was done with, when her uncle's heads adorned spikes, just when they thought they were safe, the dragons came. She had seen the fires from the windows. They had come so close, but the North made good on their word and they had come again. Saving them. Dragon Slayer. Yet another name the king in the North had earned. It was not done without injury though. They said he would be scarred for life after the encounter. Myrcella had thought he might come to the capital once it was done, he was so very close after all. He hadn't come. He had taken his men and turned back for Winterfell once more. That had been 2 years into the winter, before the snows had truly set in and the roads became impassable. She had been 2 and 10, and disappointed despite herself. The Northern Lords had insisted on taking the head of the dragon back with them, hauling it along despite how it slowed them down. They wanted a souvenir, that is what her grandfather had told her when she plucked up the courage to ask. And why shouldn't they? There were not many men who could claim their king had slain a dragon. Myrcella idly wondered whether the king in the north still regaled his lords and his court with the tale. If he revelled in the nickname that had been bestowed upon him, or whether it was tedious to him, as her uncle Jamie's was to him. She sighed, sinking down to sit at the end of her bed, her mind still casting back to the time of all the troubles. After the dragons they truly had all thought that it was it. That they could get on and endure the rapidly worsening winter in peace. It was not to be. Not 4 moons after the end of the dragons it was the turn of the north to call for aid. Myrcella distinctly remembered her mother scornfully telling her grandfather to leave them to fight their own battles. He had been livid. Her mother had been drunk. She and Tommen had slipped away in the end, but they had both heard more than enough. The wall protects us all, and the alliance with the north must hold. So to the wall he marched over 100,000 men, through snow and ice and biting winds. They had already battled the elements, and when they finally reached their destination their reward was to battle death. And so they did. It was one part of the story of the young wolf that Myrcella was happy never to read in great detail. She knew little, and she was glad of her own enforced ignorance. What she did know chilled her. The dead walking. Killing. Animating those who fell to fight against their former friends and allies. Fire did for some of them. But for others the only weapons that could repel them were made of old Valyrian steel or dragon glass. Myrcella remembered the image drawn in her book despite herself, the image that had stopped her from reading any further. Some nights it still haunted her dreams. The icy pale skin, the sunken features and, most prominent of all, the bright blue eyes that almost seemed to come alive on the page. She could not imagine facing such a thing in reality. Before she could stop herself she was remembering that the king in the north had eyes of blue. She shuddered involuntarily, inwardly begging that he would not be as cold as the monster from her nightmares. Myrcella, the soft, uncertain tones of her brother accompanied the light tap on her door. She pulled herself together, hoping she would look completely unaffected and composed to him as she called for him to come in. Tommen she smiled for him as he made his way into the room, closing the door behind him and fixing her with an apprehensive look. Grandfather said that you are to go to the north sooner, since winter is threatening once more, he said uncertainly, and she nodded her head in response. Indeed, she agreed, it hardly seems fair that it is coming once more, we have barely had a full year of summer and already the leaves are falling. If the summer was so short, then likely the winter will be too, Tommen responded, taking a few more steps into the room. Myrcella nodded her agreement, patting the space next to her. He seemed to hesitate a moment before he crossed to sit with her. Her eyes flickered to him, seeing that he was staring straight ahead at the opposite wall. She adopted a similar stance, wondering what he was thinking. Wondering if he was dreading their separation as much as she was. Through all the bad times that had been endured, she and Tommen had always had one another. They laughed together. Cried together. Avoided Joffrey together. Tommen was 6 and 10 now though, taking a more prominent role in ruling the southern kingdoms. Myrcella knew that he would never say it, but she couldn't help but believe that her grandfather was quietly impressed with how well Tommen was learning. He was a fair and just king. A kind king. Just the kind of king that was needed after all the struggles and the battles. He had wed a few moons beforehand, to Alysanne Bulwer. It was not an obvious match, one made to snub the Tyrells more than anything else. Mace had been pardoned after his treasonous support of their uncle Renly, but it was by no means forgotten. Alysanne was a cousin of his line, so he could not make any complaint that his house was not being favored. It was an open secret, however, that he had wanted his own daughter to be queen rather than a distant relative. In Myrcella's own opinion, which of course she would never voice, Tommen would likely be far happier with Alysanne. She was very pretty, and of his age. To Myrcella's eye she always seemed gentle, and softly spoken, the perfect match for her kind-hearted brother. She knew her mother looked down on her, irritated that a richer and more prosperous match had not been found for him. Tommen was unaffected by her indifference, he walked with a new spring in his step and a smile on his face since his wedding. If only she could be so lucky. "I'll miss you," he broke the silence, and she glanced to see him still staring straight at the wall. "I'll miss you too, but you have Alysanne now to keep you company, I know you will be happy with her," Myrcella replied to him, her own eyes looking down at her entwined hands. "You could be happy too," he said hopefully, "Robb was always kind to us at Winterfell." Myrcella smiled slightly at that, She had had little, if any, interaction with Robb Stark all those years ago. It was easy to assume the same of Tommen, but of course he had regularly frequented the tiltyard with the other boys. "I think you saw more of him than I ever did," she commented, clenching her fists tightly to stop her hands from shaking. "Remember when Joffrey Tommen could still barely utter their brother's name without stammering? When he wanted us to use real steel, Bran and I," he continued, and she nodded her head slightly in agreement. "Robb wouldn't allow it, he said it wasn't proper, that one of us could get hurt," Tommen went on. "Not many people ever refused Joffrey," Myrcella conceded, feeling Tommen shift a little closer to her. In the next moment his arm wrapped around her shoulder and she leaned into him. "I know you must be frightened," he said quietly, "and I know you must think that he will hate you, after everything that happened. But we are all allied now, and Joffrey's sins were not ours, nor were Uncle Jaime's. We did nothing wrong, Myrcella. You did nothing wrong, and if he believes that you did, then I am demanding now, as your king, that you put him right. You never let Joffrey best you, and you always looked after me, shielded me from him. Robb Stark is not Joffrey, you can handle him. I know you can." "They call him Dragonslayer," Myrcella said wryly, and Tommen snorted, squeezing her shoulder tightly. "Because he came to our aid, because he honored the treaty he signed with Grandfather. You were part of that pact, he will honor you as well." Tommen sounded so certain that she almost believed him. She ached to believe him. "Perhaps you're right," she said, hoping that her voice didn't betray her inner skepticism. "Even if he wants to despise you, he never could, not when he comes to know you," he said, and she smiled slightly. "That's just it, Tommen, what if he doesn't want to know me?" she asked almost fearfully, lifting her head up from his shoulder so she could meet his eyes. "He will have no choice," he said simply, a sad little smile on his own face. "No," Myrcella agreed, saved from having to elaborate further by another knock on the door. "Come," she called out. Perhaps it was best that her conversation with Tommen ended now. Perhaps it was best that she left him thinking that she was reassured and hopeful, instead of unburdening herself and revealing the true extent of her apprehension. Etta slipped around the door in the next moment, her grin faltering when her eyes found that Myrcella had company. "Your Grace, Princess," she curtsied politely before them, keeping her eyes meekly on the floor when she rose back up. Myrcella couldn't help but smirk. Etta did a wonderful impression of a demure and proper young woman when she wanted to. "I will leave you now," Tommen said, a slightly regretful look in his eye as he unwound his arm from her shoulder. She missed the pressure instantly. The warmth. All too soon everything would be cold for her, and the dread was slowly creeping in further. "I will see you before," Myrcella trailed off, unwilling and unable to speak the final words. Tommen merely nodded in response, inclining his head in Etta's direction before he left the room. "Has something happened?" Etta was wide-eyed and crossing to her as soon as the door closed behind Tommen. "Winter is threatening again, and if it is doing so here it will most certainly be doing so in the north," Myrcella said, seeing her handmaiden frown slightly. "Which means I will be going to Winterfell early, 2 days from now to be precise," she elaborated, despising the shake that had crept into her voice. 2 days. Etta repeated in a rather dazed manner, and Myrcella nodded her head, doing her best to smile. "I need to gather my things," she said. It was not what she wanted to say, but if she began confessing her fears now then she was afraid she would never stop. Etta met her eyes for a long moment before she slowly nodded her head. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she didn't. Either way, Myrcella was glad that she was not pushing her on the subject. "Of course," Etta said, "your warmest dresses, I think, Princess." Myrcella smiled her agreement, rising up from the end of the bed so she could approach her dressing room. Etta followed after her, and for a long minute both of them just stood and stared at the racks of clothing that lined the walls. Myrcella knew that she would likely never see the majority of these dresses again, let alone wear them. Even when summer came, the north was still far colder than the capital. She moved closer to one of the dresses, her hand going to touch the pale green silk, her fingers savoring the feel of it as her touch moved along the neckline to toy with the creamy lace. Vaguely she wondered if she would ever wear silks and lace again. "You could still wear it," Etta seemed to have read her mind, "though perhaps with thick underskirts and a cloak about your shoulders." Imagining a heavy cloak around such a delicate and intricately made dress made Myrcella simultaneously want to laugh and cry. I wore it to Tommen's wedding, she said quietly, remembering how happy she had been in that dress as she had been twirled about during the dancing afterwards. She sighed, not wanting to taint her wonderful memories by taking it with her to the north. It was silly. It was only a dress after all, and yet to Ursula, just touching it and seeing it before her was enough to transport her back to a happier time. I don't think I will have reason to wear it again, she continued, finally letting go of the fabric. You don't know that, Etta said kindly, and Ursula summoned up all her strength before she turned around to face her. I think I do, she said, a slight smile forced to her lips. Best we dig out my clothes from the last winter, could be that some of them still fit, she said. Very well, princess, if you insist upon it, Etta said heavily, but I still think you should take that one. The king in the north would be unable to resist you in it. Ursula smiled wryly. She was grateful for Etta's words, and grateful that she was trying to reassure her as Tommen had. Perhaps the king in the north would desire her in the dress. She was frequently regaled for her beauty. Desire was not the same as love, however, nor even the same as caring. Men desired whores, and she knew well enough what the world thought of them. She closed her eyes and took a long breath, pushing unsavory thoughts from her mind. Thank you, Etta, she said when she opened them again. I appreciate your kindness, but I think it will take more than a pretty dress to make him forget who I am. Chapter 3, 2, A King's Torment. Notes. Big thank you. I am so overwhelmed by how many of you left kudos. Also, super big thanks to those who left comments as well. A question cropped up about POVs, so to answer that, the story will alternate between just Robb and Ursula, though I will do the odd snippet from King's Landing which will be either Cersei or Jaime, though that will be a rare occurrence. Just thank you all so much for all the positive comments so far. I've never written this pairing before, let alone done anything in Ursula's POV, so seeing such feedback is really encouraging. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this next chapter. Oh, and one more thing, italics mean flashbacks, though I'm sure you would have figured that out, winking smiley. Happy smiley. Chapter text. Robb. He stamped towards his tent as the light had grown too weak for them to continue on today. The men around him were grateful for the respite, already shouting about lighting fires and making food. Robb's own stomach snarled with hunger, but he easily ignored it. He didn't much care if anyone brought him anything or not, he just wanted a cup of strong ale before he inevitably passed out on the makeshift bed. His mother would tell him he was pushing himself too hard. His mother wasn't here though, that was part of the reason that he was. The people were praising him and his kindness. They didn't have to know that he was here helping them gather the harvest for his own selfish reasons. He had started doing so around Wintertown at first, but that still meant retiring back to Winterfell at night, and being confronted with his mother's sympathetic gaze. It had been the same ever since the letter from the capital had come, and Robb had reached the end of his tether. In the end Robb had snapped, announcing his intention to go to Moat Cailin, and then Barrowtown, and finally, Torrens Square, to help them gather the harvests. It was his duty as king to aid his people in such times, that is what he had told his mother anyway. She had seen right through him, and she had protested loudly in private. He had ignored her, and when it came time for him to leave she had had no choice but to wave him off with a smile along with the rest of them. Working all day out in the fields gave him something real to focus on, something which sitting behind his desk and perusing missives and signing documents could never give him. It allowed him to clear his mind entirely, whereas sitting in his father's study would always have memories creeping in and finding him when he least expected it. Some of them were suffocating. Some of them made him smile. Most of them were not even memories, just anticipation of what was to come when she arrived. He wrenched the flap of his tent to the side and stamped in, moving to the basin in the corner. The water was freezing cold, but it would serve him well enough. He splashed it over his face, which was no doubt covered in dirt again, before he turned his attention to scrubbing under his fingernails. Vaguely he wondered if he would ever manage to get them perfectly clean again. Almost as quickly he realized that he didn't care. A drink was his focus now, almost as he thought it. A call came from the other side of the canvas. It was his new squire, Billy, and he deposited a plate of simple-looking food and a large flagon of ale onto the table at Robb's instruction. In his mind Billy was still new to him, even though he had been his squire for near 2 years now. Oliver had long since been knighted, and it had taken Rob years to even think of a replacement for him. His council had insisted in the end, it was proper, or so they told him. He gave in, choosing a boy from the town to take the position as his own form of rebellion. Thank you. Rob remembered his manners in time, and Billy looked delighted at the praise. He was still a young lad, not quite 5 and 10 yet, but he was harmless enough and coming on well with the sword. Rob sat heavily in his chair and pulled the food towards him. It was the same every night. Cold meat with a slab of cheese and a roll of bread. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep his hunger at bay until he fell asleep. He took a few bites, though it did little to indulge his taste, before he turned his attention to the flagon of ale. This was the time of night he hated, the time between finishing up in the fields and going to bed. He had tried on previous nights to occupy himself by spending time out with the men, drinking and playing card games. Even then his mind had wandered to things he would prefer not to think about. Top of that list was his coming nuptials. If there had been one thing that he had hoped to avoid for as long as possible, it was that. Now she was coming early, and so too would the wedding. He wondered if he would even be able to muster a smile for her, if he would not recoil away from the touch of her hand when they said their vows in the gods would. Because they would say them. They had no choice in the matter. He forced down more of the food to try and shift his mind away from Myrcella Baratheon. He almost choked. That was a joke. The girl was pure Lannister, and he was dreading her more than he had dreaded facing the dragons all those years ago. He had been invited to recover his strength properly at the capital. He had declined. Being there meant seeing her, and he had known he would not be able to deal with it. Even now he wasn't sure he would deal with it. He laughed without humor. How was he supposed to take this girl into his home and into his bed if he was unsure if he would even be able to look at her? More ale appeared to be the answer. He drank deeply from the flagon. His mother would likely have scolded him for not pouring it into a tankard. He shook his head, banging it back down against the table. His mother wasn't here. Thank the gods. If she were, he would be in for another lecture about how he had to give Myrcella a chance. About how she were not to blame for what her brother and her uncle had done. She just had the misfortune to be born to Cersei Lannister. It was no more fault of hers than it had been Rob's that he were born a Stark. My family is not made up of murderers and treasonous bastards. And so that particular lecture was ended. More and more would be sprung on him though, and the more his mother pushed him the more he dug in his heels. Somewhere deep inside he knew he was being unfair, and he knew that Myrcella was likely relishing this about as much as he was. He refused to care though, and every time he saw Bran sat out in the tiltyard watching the men mournfully his resolve strengthened that little bit more. Rob drained the rest of the flagon before he stood up and pulled off the dirt-smeared rag his tunic had become. Working out in the fields it was more than adequate to keep him warm. Now he had stopped for the day and the night was coming in faster. He found himself cold. His boots came next before he loosened the laces of his breeches and climbed beneath the mountain of furs on the bed. Likely grey wind would return sometime near dawn and wake him for the next day of the harvest. Rob closed his eyes and sighed heavily, allowing the combination of his exhaustion and the large flagon of strong ale to send him to sleep. She ran her hands shakily over his chest, her breathing ragged against his skin as she moved to lay her head against him. His own hand found the small of her back, feeling her skin damp and slick beneath his touch. She turned her head, her lips coming to her chest, her tongue trailing up from his ribs in the next moment. "What are you doing?" he asked in breathless amusement. "Tasting you," she replied, lifting her head up to look at him through lowered lashes. "And what, pray tell, do I taste of?" He raised a brow and she smiled wickedly at him. "Man," she said simply, and he reached his hand down lower until he could squeeze her bottom firmly. "I suppose I can have no complaints about that." He smirked at her, and she bit down on her bottom lip, shaking her head slowly. "No," she agreed, "no, I suppose you can't." She tailed off as he brought his other hand to the back of her neck, encouraging her to lean into him. Their lips met in the next moment and he laced his tongue with hers, twisting it in her mouth so he could taste her back. She pulled back too quickly, her eyes darkened with lust again and her breathing just a little bit too fast. "I ought to go," she said, regret evident in her tone. "Stay," he said, knowing that she wouldn't from the half-smile that twitched her lips. It will do neither of us any good if your mother catches me in the keep again, you know that, she told him seriously, and he sighed heavily. He was a man grown, and a king to boot, and yet his mother could still make him feel like a naughty child. What my mother doesn't know, cannot hurt her, he said with a raised brow, but she pushed away from him anyway, swinging her legs off the edge of the bed and rising up. He watched her as she moved to gather up her clothing, his eyes roaming every inch of her bare skin. They lingered on her hips, which were beautifully curved from the birth of 2 children. Her breasts were full and soft, and gods, he loved to have them in his hands. In his mouth. His perusal was interrupted as she pulled her shift over her head and he made a disgruntled noise. "Are you ever satisfied, Your Grace?" she asked him teasingly, and he shook his head slowly, silently pleading with her to come back to his bed. "You know I can't stay," she said firmly, clearly having read his intent all too clearly. "Will you come tomorrow?" he asked before he could stop himself, and she fixed him with a look for a long moment. "This is happening too much," she said almost fearfully. "It cannot go on forever. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been best if it never started." Rob woke irritably, his eyes blinking, awake to find Grey Wind had pushed his way past the entrance flap. No doubt it had been him letting in a stream of cold air that had roused him. He narrowed his eyes at Grey Wind, but his wolf seemed unperturbed, merely coming closer and jumping up onto the bed. If Rob had the heart he would have shoved him off. He was far too big and had been for years. He didn't though. The extra warmth of his wolf would no doubt have him drifting back to sleep in no time. The bed creaked ominously as Grey Wind settled himself on the other side of him, and Rob sighed heavily. "You shouldn't eat so much," he muttered to his wolf, who huffed loudly in response as he lay his head between his front paws and closed his eyes. Rob rolled his eyes and shifted a little beneath the furs to get into a more comfortable position. He gave up after a moment, bringing his hands up to his face as he remembered his dream. His memory. Ada had not been the first woman he had taken to bed, but she had been his only long-term lover. Sometimes he missed her at night, and he knew that that was selfish, knew that she was far better off now than she had been sharing his bed night after night. His mother had not been impressed, but Rob couldn't help himself. He had been drawn to her from the first moment he set eyes on her. At first he had told himself that it was because he pitied her, because he felt responsible for her widowed status and the fact that her young children would grow up without a father. He made excuses to spend time with her, drop by her home and make sure she had everything she needed as the winter set in. It was a year before they kissed, but after that they hadn't stopped. He was reckless with her, too reckless. It still chilled him that he could easily have planted a child in her. He hadn't. Thank the gods. If he closed his eyes he could still feel her soft, dark curls twisting around his hands. Could still inhale the musky, sweet scent of her. He could feel her in his mouth. Feel her nails pinching into his back as he took pleasure from her glorious body. He could hear her gasping, feel her trembling beneath him as she fell apart and cried out his name. He rubbed his hands across his face again. This was doing him no good. Thinking of Ada and the time they had had together only served to remind him that it was now over. It had been for over a year, and his bed had remained cold despite the brief coming of summer. He tried not to think about who would next occupy his bed. Doing that only made him think of tumbling golden locks and cold green eyes. They said Myrcella was as beautiful as her mother, more so even. That mattered not to Rob, not if she were of the same character as well. He despised Cersei Lannister, despised the fact that she had got away with everything. At least the Kingslayer had been punished for a time. At least Joffrey was dead. But her. He clenched his fists together and took a long, deep breath. It was too much to ask the Myrcella not be like her mother. She had been betrothed to him for almost half her life. Half her life that her mother had no doubt spent dripping poison in her ear and making her as twisted and cold as she was. What hope did they have? What hope did their children have? This was not how he had always imagined being married. He had imagined being able to love his wife, to care for her at least. He had imagined that their children would see united and happy parents. That image had swiftly died in him the day Tywin Lannister named his terms. His mother was forever telling him to hope, to believe that he and Myrcella could have a happy future together. You know nothing about her, Rob. You cannot just assume that she is a double of her mother. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps she was wrong. Either way, it did nothing to stop Rob imagining the worst. Grey Wind let out a snore at his side, pulling him from his increasingly irritable thoughts. He huffed in irritation and turned firmly away from his wolf, jamming his eyes closed determinedly. He ran his fingers slowly up and down her spine as her own whispered patterns in the hair adorning his chest. She was quiet tonight, and he had seen the look in her eye when he had lain her down on the bed. It was almost as though she wanted to tell him something but had not thought up the words yet. He had considered stopping, asking her what was wrong, but she had wrapped her legs around his waist before he could muster the words, and from then on he was lost. Now though he was thinking again, and thinking the worst. Somewhere in the pit of his stomach he somehow knew that this night with Ada would be his last. She was almost confirming it to him herself by the way she had stayed at his side rather than shifting away at once to redress herself. He swallowed hard, wondering if she would tell him, or if she would just leave and never come back. If he had the words he would ask her, but part of him was afraid of the answer. "Tom has been visiting lately," she said quietly, her finger still moving against his skin. "Tom," he repeated questioningly, a slight frown creasing his brow. "The baker," she elaborated. He knew now, the man had recently moved from one of the villages around Carhold. Winterfell had lost its own baker, Melvin, during the winter, so Tom's arrival had been welcome indeed. "Why?" he asked, thinking he already knew the answer, but wanting to hear it from her own lips. He brought some gingerbread for the children the first time, she told him. He had more excuses to drop by after that. "Last week he fixed that gap in the window pane, and I asked him to stay for dinner." "I assume he did," Rob muttered irritably, his hand stilling against her back. "He's a good man, and he knows a good trade. I have to consider my future, and the future of my children," she explained to him, and he closed his eyes. He knew she was right, and he knew that he could offer her nothing aside from the other side of his bed. Even that would not be his to share with her for much longer. He sighed, turning his head and pressing a kiss to her creased brow. "I understand," he whispered against her skin, feeling her body relax and her brow smooth under his lips. She raised her head so she could look down on him, one of her hands coming to push his damp curls back from his brow. "I don't regret coming to you," she murmured, "but you know it cannot go on any longer, not if Tom asks for my hand, which I am hopeful he will." "I know," Rob agreed, though it was with a heavy heart. "Though, I do not know what I will do with my evenings now," he went on with a smile, determined to lighten the mood. "I am sure there are many a woman who would gladly take my place," she said teasingly, her nails pinching lightly into his chest for a moment. "I don't think I could have them," he confessed. "If I were any kind of man then I would never have had you." "Why did you?" she asked him curiously, her eyes searching as she met his own. "I wanted to help you. Your husband was dead and you were facing the winter with 2 young children to look after. I wanted to try and make some of it right, but then, the more time I spent with you," he trailed off, raising his brows slightly. "I suppose I couldn't help myself," he finally finished, and she smiled slightly. "I never imagined being with anyone but my husband," she said, sadness shining in her eyes now that made guilt bubble up inside him. "Ada, he began. "But I have told you before that I do not regret this." Foolish as it was, she cut him off, a smile twitching her lips. "When John died I was left even more alone than when he left for war. I knew our boys would grow without a father, and that I would have to provide for them and try and keep them alive through the winter. Then you came, and you slowly became more of a man to me than a king, and in the end," she hesitated, shaking her head slightly. "Well," she smiled, "in the end I suppose that I couldn't help myself either." "What a pair we are," he said softly, twisting a loose lock of her hair around his fingers. "I have a second chance with Tom," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "And I would never seek to take that from you. You have my word, Ada, what has happened between us will remain between us," he promised her, "and I wish you every happiness, you and your children." Her lips pressed together tightly at that, her eyes shining as she looked down on him. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice slightly choked. "And you know where I am, if ever you should have need of me. If your family has need of me then you only need ask and I will do anything I can for you," he continued. "Thank you," she said again, nodding her head in a rather determined manner. "You deserve to be happy, you know," she went on after a moment of silence. He smiled wryly at that, still twisting her hair between his fingers. "You know who your queen will be," he said quietly, "so do not expect me to hold out much hope for a happy future." Ada pulled away slightly at that, shifting herself so she was sat at his side looking down on him. You cannot imagine the worst before you have even met her, she told him seriously, and he snorted. Of course I can, I know where she comes from, he said, and her frown deepened. You cannot judge her on the sins of her family, she said almost incredulously, her eyes wide. Ada, how can I be expected to just forget that she is a Lannister? How can I expect her to forget that? He asked her expectantly. You don't, she said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. You just find a way to live with it, to see around it. Just because she came from Cersei Lannister, it does not mean she will have her nature. She could be the very opposite for all you know, and the only way you will ever find out is if you approach this marriage with an open mind. A clean slate. Do not make the mistake of thinking that you are the only one who suffered during the war. I cannot imagine it was easy for her when the dragons came, or when the dead awoke. She may not have fought, Robb, but it does not mean that she did not feel. The princess had no more choice in this match than you did, even less so really. You could have said no. Do you think anyone ever asked her if she consented? Robb sighed heavily at her words, hating the guilt that they had twisting in his stomach. He didn't want to feel guilt over Myrcella, not now when he was in the midst of his last night with Ada. You sound like my mother, he muttered, and she raised her brows at him. Well, perhaps you might consider that we may both be right, she said irritably, and he sighed again, moving his hand to wrap lightly around her wrist. Let's not do this, he implored her. Come here, please. This is our last night together, can we not just forget about reality and lose ourselves until dawn? Robb woke again, the stirring of the men rousing him this time. He rubbed the sleep from his bleary eyes and jabbed his elbow into Grey Wind's side. His wolf growled softly in his sleep, but he did not open his eyes. He sighed, deciding to just leave him there. It was not like he could help gather the harvest anyway. Robb climbed out of bed, shivering in the cold morning air and hunting for his clothes at once. He pulled on his tunic, before forcing socks and boots onto his feet and tightening the laces on his breeches. Then he sought out his doublet and cloak, knowing he would likely discard them later when he worked up a sweat in the fields, but grateful for the extra warmth for the time being. When he had wrapped his cloak around him, he pushed the canvas flap aside and stamped out into the camp. There was a frost dusting the ground again, and he looked up to see the sky slowly lightening as the sun rose from beneath the horizon. At least a frost meant there would be no rain, that at least was something to be grateful for given the nature of their work. Good morning, Your Grace, one of the men beside the closest fire greeted him, and he inclined his head in response. Good morning, he returned, his voice slightly hoarse in the chill of the morning. It was nothing some hot wine and a good breakfast would not cure, and so he set off through camp, his eyes searching for Billy. He caught sight of him eventually, and his squire jumped to his feet as Robb called out his name. Breakfast will not be long, Your Grace, the boy gabbled out at once, and there is already some wine heated, if it please you, Your Grace. It would please me immensely, thank you, Billy, Robb replied, making sure he remembered to smile. It was not his young squire's fault that his mind was tormented with thoughts of his former lover and his upcoming marriage to a woman he didn't want. He remembered Ada's words from so long ago, now fresh in his mind after his dreams about her the night before. You could have said no. Do you think anyone ever asked her if she consented? Those words had needled at him in a way that none of his mothers ever had. He closed his eyes. It was easy to think of Myrcella as an indulged and pampered princess. Ada's words though, they made him question that, and the result made his head ache whenever he dwelled on them. Here you are, Your Grace. Billy, handing him a cup of hot wine, pulled him from his troubled thoughts. He took it with thanks, remembering to smile again, as he determined that he would not think of Ada or Myrcella for the rest of the day. Chapter 4:3, Bleak and Beautiful. Notes. Thank you all so much for the kudos and the comments. I really appreciate your positive vibes. Sorry to disappoint, Emperor Kaiser, but this chapter won't be Myrcella in the Riverlands. As for political spice, Tywin has no reason to cause trouble given that this was his idea. I also don't think Bolton or the Freys would act against Robb of their own accord. Cersei, however, well, that's a different story. Right, I hope everyone enjoys this new one. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Myrcella. She jolted awake as the carriage hit yet another bump in the road, her head smacking against the wooden sides. Ursula cursed groggily, bringing her hand up to her head to rub the spot she had just bashed. It throbbed dully, but she imagined the pain would soon fade. She was more interested in knowing how far they had come now. For the past days they had been traveling through the riverlands, and from that Ursula knew that it would not be long before they crossed the border and into the north. Into another kingdom entirely, ruled by a different king. A kingdom I will soon be wed to, a kingdom I will soon be queen of. She shuddered, allowing herself to believe it was because of the chill in the air. She pulled her thick fur stole further around her shoulders and moved her hand to pull back the thick drape that covered the single window the carriage possessed. It was still dark out, not pitch black, but still likely an hour or so before dawn. She allowed the drape to fall back into place and slumped back down against the cushions. There was no bed in the carriage, merely a bench that had been upholstered and an array of furs, blankets and cushions for her to fashion into something comfortable enough to sleep on. She had had the option of stopping each night at an inn, but she had refused it. Her guard were able to survive on only a few hours' sleep, at least that is what they told her, and so she had been happy to stay in the carriage and allow them to move them along whenever they pleased. It would mean reaching the north sooner, something that she both longed for and dreaded. She longed to get there because then she would know exactly what she would be faced with. Then again, she also dreaded thinking about what she might face, terrified that her worst fears would be revealed. She determined not to dwell on it now, grabbing one of the cushions and punching it into shape before she tucked it under her head and closed her eyes. The sway of the carriage soon evened out and her eyes began to droop. She vaguely wondered if this is how babies felt when they were rocked in their mother's arms, that they found the movement hypnotic and ever so soothing. Ursula pulled her furs more tightly around her and shifted to find a better position. She wondered, as she let out a long sigh and snuggled herself around another of the cushions, if her own mother had ever rocked her to sleep, or whether she was just tended to by her nurses. It would be nice, Ursula thought, just before sleep took her, to one day be able to rock a child of her own to sleep in her arms. Ursula fiddled with the little catch that held the window shut, finally managing to work the stiff fastening loose. Once it was, she pulled the window open and fastened it so with the little hook that was hanging on the inside of the carriage. She breathed in the rush of freezing air greedily, daring to stick her head a little way out of the window. They were nearly there, one of her guards had told her the night before when she had ventured down from her carriage to stretch her legs. Soon Winterfell would be upon them, and she was starting to feel a horrible twisting sensation in the pit of her stomach. It was nerves, no doubt, and she willed them away. The last thing she wanted to appear before the Starks was frightened. She wanted to show them that she could be strong and hardy and survive in the north. If she went before them trembling with fear, then they would likely imagine she would not last the winter. Perhaps they would prefer that. She stuck her head further out of the window at that unsavory thought, not caring that the freezing air made her eyes stream, nor that it was likely making her cheeks red raw. It felt good. Real. She needed so desperately to feel something real, something that could distract her from her tightly knotted stomach. Despite herself, she wondered what the king in the north was doing now. Did he know she would soon be upon him? Was his stomach twisting as hers was? Perhaps he was pacing nervously, or perhaps he was working off his tension in the tilt-yard. Perhaps he was unaffected. Unmoved. Perhaps he didn't care at all that she would soon be arriving. She closed her eyes and pulled her head back into the carriage, wiping the moisture from her cheeks. The last thing she needed was for it to look as though she had been crying when she arrived. She could already imagine the knowing looks. She wondered if they would feel pity for her, or if they felt she deserved to suffer. Ursula let her head lean against the side of the carriage so she could look out into the vast bleakness of the north. She remembered back to another lifetime when she had been traveling in a far larger carriage with Tommen and their mother. She remembered how excited they had been, how they had clamored at the window and tried to get their mother to join in their joy. There is nothing to see, it is only wasteland. Ursula could not disagree more. Yes, the north was cold, and there was not much that was not green or grey. But it was beautiful in its own way. So vast and unending and so stunningly different from everything she was used to. Bleak and beautiful, two things that ought not to fit together, seemed to work perfectly here. She smiled slightly and arranged her stole better around her neck as the cold air filled the carriage. There was no way she was closing the window though, she had to get used to this, and she wanted to see more of the wild north. Banners, a shout from outside drew Ursula's attention after several moments of her just gazing out at the scenery flashing by the window. I see the turrets, another called, and the pace of her carriage seemed to increase ever so slightly. Her heart pounded wildly, knowing that it could only be Winterfell they were approaching as they had passed through Sawin earlier in the day. She swallowed hard and nervously fiddled with her stole, looking down at her skirts to make sure they were not too creased from traveling. In the next moment her hand went to her hair, praying that it did not look disheveled from when she had stuck her head out of the window. Gods, what a stupid thing to do that had been. She practically dived across the carriage to root out her vanity box from under the seats opposite hers. Her guards were shouting to one another again as she rummaged quickly through for her brush. "The gates are up, we'll ride right through," one of them shouted, and she hurriedly dragged the brush through the tangled strands of her hair as quickly as she could. She just knew when the carriage had passed under the gate, feeling the difference in the smoothness of the ground beneath the wheels. Hurriedly she dropped the brush back into the box and slammed the lid closed, tossing her hair back over her shoulders and quickly moving back to her seat, hoping she had arranged herself on it in an unaffected manner. All too soon the carriage began to slow and she felt a lump rise up in her throat that would not disappear, no matter how hard she swallowed. Her stomach was churning so rapidly now that a part of her seriously thought that she might be sick. She clenched her fists, her nails sinking into her palms as she took long, deep breaths. In the next moment the door of her carriage opened and she turned her head to meet the eyes of one of her guard. "Are you ready, princess? You never let Joffrey best you. Robb Stark is not Joffrey." Remembering Tommen's words in his determined tone gave her the courage she needed to nod her head, bringing a smile to her face that she hoped did not resemble a grimace. She placed her hand firmly in the one her guard held out to her and shifted so she could step down from the carriage in the most dignified manner she could manage. 1 step. 2 step. Her booted feet found the flagstones of the courtyard of Winterfell. She kept her eyes on the stones, taking one final deep breath before she looked up to see who was gathered to greet her. She swallowed, blinking stupidly. "Princess Myrcella, welcome back to Winterfell." The smile on Lady Stark's face looked rather strained, but Myrcella appreciated the effort, taking a few uncertain steps towards her. "Thank you, my lady." She inclined her head politely, not sure whether she should drop into a full curtsy or not. She had not expected this. She had expected the king to be here, she had prepared herself for him and she had memorized exactly how she would conduct herself. If he was here then of course she would have dropped into a curtsy, there could be no question of not doing so. It was only his mother though, and though she was mother to the king, Myrcella still outranked her. Her head was spinning, her mouth opening as though to say something, and then closing again because she could think of no words. Even if she could think of any, she doubted they would come. The lump in her throat had apparently doubled in size. "Allow me to show you to the keep." Lady Stark inclined her own head in return. "The servants will take care of your men and make sure your things are taken to your chambers. I don't believe you would decline a glass of wine." As she spoke, she beckoned Myrcella to follow her and she did so obediently, her eyes darting around the courtyard, looking for any sign of the rest of the Stark family. "I would not, thank you, my lady," Myrcella confirmed as she followed Lady Stark up the steps of the keep. Myrcella noted, as they passed between the guards that flanked the outer doors, that Lady Stark was swathed in black. Still mourning her husband. She swallowed hard, unable to remember her mother ever wearing black for her father. For Joffrey, yes. But not for their father. "You must forgive the lack of a proper welcome party." Lady Stark apologized as the guards opened the inner doors for them so they could step into the entrance hall. "You were not expected this soon," the older woman continued on as the doors were firmly closed behind them again. "We made good speed," Myrcella said, the only thing she could think of. "Quite," Lady Stark agreed, leading her down a hallway that was vaguely familiar to her, though she could not quite remember why. She opened the third door they came to, gesturing for Myrcella to enter the room first. There was a fire dancing happily in the grate, and an inexplicable warmth to the small parlor she had been shown to. "Sit, please." Lady Stark indicated her, and Myrcella did as she was told. Slowly she removed the stole from around her neck. It was rather stifling now that she was within the warm confines of the keep. Lady Stark set about pouring 2 glasses of wine, Myrcella thanking her when she passed her one of them. To your safe arrival, Lady Stark toasted her with a smile, before she too settled herself down, taking the armchair that was opposite Myrcilla's. You're too kind, she responded, before taking a tiny sip from her glass. You must forgive the absence of my children, Lady Stark said apologetically. I am afraid that Rob is away from Winterfell, aiding the men with the harvest. He assured me in his last letter that he would be traveling back before long. Myrcilla wasn't sure what to say to that, so she merely smiled in what she hoped was a serene manner, before she took a larger mouthful of wine. I am sure his grace has much to contend with, what with winter so fast approaching, she said when she had swallowed it. I would hate my arrival to cause any inconvenience to his duty to his subjects. Indeed, we did not expect to be facing the snows again so soon, Lady Stark said heavily, her eyes becoming slightly unfocused for a moment. As for the others, Rickon is in his lessons. Arya is the gods only nowhere, and Sansa of course no longer dwells at Winterfell. Bran is likely in the library or with the Maester. He has an almost unquenchable thirst for knowledge, she tailed off, a slightly regretful look in her eye as she spoke about her second son. Myrcilla swallowed hard. The memory of Bran's accident and who was responsible for it was hanging thick and unspoken in the air between them. I was so very pleased to hear about Lady Sansa's marriage. Myrcilla forced a smile, hoping to clear some of the rapidly rising tension. Thank you, Lady Stark replied, she is most happy. Where does she reside now, if I may ask? Myrcilla enquired, hoping that it was true that Sansa was indeed happy. After what she had suffered at the capital, she deserved a whole lifetime of happiness. Only a few leagues north of here, one of the old holdfasts was restored and gifted to her husband when he was knighted. After the wedding, Sansa moved there with him, Lady Stark told her, and Myrcilla nodded her head. It must be nice, having her close, she commented. Does she visit Winterfell often? She and Oliver come when they can. Their visits are slightly less frequent now they have the girls, Lady Stark answered her, a wistful smile coming to her face. Of course, Myrcilla said. May I ask how old they are? She had known that Sansa was mother to one daughter. News had trickled down to the capital a little over a year ago, but she had no knowledge of a second. Bethany has 2 name days, Lady Stark informed her, and little Rhea was born a mere 3 weeks ago. There was inexplicable joy in her future good mother's voice when she spoke about her little granddaughters, and Myrcilla couldn't help but smile. That's so wonderful, you must be so thrilled, she said, hoping Lady Stark didn't doubt her sincerity. The older woman smiled, but Myrcilla wondered if she had imagined the slightly uneasy look in her eye. It was gone in a blink and Myrcilla determined to forget about it, smiling back at her. Thank you, Lady Stark said, our family has been blessed indeed in recent times. Now, perhaps I can show you to your chamber. Myrcilla nodded, placing down her empty glass and rising carefully up to her feet again. That would be most kind, she said as Lady Stark rose to her own feet and made her way to the door. It's the least I can do, given your poor welcome, Lady Stark replied, and this time Myrcilla was sure she had caught a tone of irritation. She wondered whether the woman was irritated with her children for not being in attendance, or irritated with her for even being here. Thinking made her head hurt, and she decided to just hope that it was the former. If it was the latter, then she would likely have no hope whatsoever of being accepted here. Robb Stark may well be the king, but it was well known how much of an influence his mother was to him. Lady Stark had left her alone in the end, imploring her to ask should she need anything. Myrcilla had smiled and been as polite as she could, wanting more than anything to endear herself to her future good mother. She wondered if the king had kept away on purpose. She wondered if he wanted to hear his family's impression of her first. Perhaps she was just thinking too hard about it. More than likely he really had just been held up helping the men with the harvest. It didn't seem like something a king ought to be doing, but then again, as she was forever reminding herself, things in the north were done differently. She could never imagine Tommen going out and aiding the men with gathering stores. Not because her brother lacked the compassion nor the heart for it, but because their grandfather would never allow it if the idea ever did come into his head. After a few moments of just concentrating on breathing calmly, Myrcilla really began to take in her surroundings. Her chamber was modest but perfectly clean and cozy looking. A fire had already been lit in the grate and was dancing happily. From the warmth of the room she imagined that it had been lit some time before she arrived. There was a dresser in one corner, next to the window. A vanity was placed on the other side of the window. The bed dominated the wall opposite the fire. It was a large space with what looked like an entire mountain of furs atop it. She imagined that she wouldn't have need of all of them just yet. Her imagination then ran further, and before she could stop herself she was wondering if the king would ever share this space with her, or if she would be summoned to his bedchamber if he had need of her. She shuddered, averting her eyes from the bed and taking in the rest of her new living space. The door to her chamber was between the fire and the dresser, and on the other side of the fire there was a screen. She imagined that a bathtub was placed behind it, and she approached and peered behind it just to confirm her thoughts. Against the wall opposite the window there was a table with two comfortable-looking chairs. Again her imagination took off without her, wondering if she and the king could ever be comfortable enough with one another to take meals in private. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, looking instead towards the empty shelves that stood next to the bed. They looked rather forlorn, standing empty in such a cozy space. Really they ought to be laden down with books and trinkets. She had a few trinkets with her belongings, but only one book. Really, she ought to have brought more, but she had assumed that the Starks would have a plentiful supply. She bit her lip and remembered Lady Stark mentioning a library. Her mind was made up then. She snatched up her stole before she could talk herself out of it, wrapping it around her shoulders before she marched with intent from the room. She remembered the way down to the entrance hall without any trouble, hesitating slightly before she approached the guards that were stationed on either side of the inner door. "Would you mind pointing me towards the library?" she asked them hopefully, seeing them exchange a glance with one another. She couldn't read their expressions, half their faces hidden by beards. "It's in the east wing," Princess One informed her. "Follow the main hallway down to the end and you will come to it." "Thank you," she said, her voice laced with more relief than she had intended. They merely inclined their heads to her in response and she offered them a smile before she turned and made her way towards the hallway that led through the eastern part of the keep. The hallway forked at the end, but there was a door stood right before her and it was slightly ajar. She moved quietly towards it and looked through the gap, smiling in relief when she saw the shelves of books within. Ursula opened the door more widely and stepped inside, pushing it to again before she set off down one of the rows. Idly she kept her eyes on the shelves, her eyes scanning the spines of the books as she drifted around one of the corners, waiting for something to catch her interest. "Princess Ursula," she jumped, though the voice was soft she had not been expecting it. She whirled around, finding the man the voice belonged to. Her eyes widened when she saw him. He was older, and had a hint of stubble on his cheeks, but his eyes and his features were easily recognizable. There was a slight smile on his lips, and an almost nervous look in his eye that put Ursula at ease at once. "Lord Bran," she greeted him in an almost relieved manner, a smile breaking out on her own face. "Welcome to my domain," he said in a teasing manner, and her smile only widened. "You must be kept well entertained here," she commented, casting her eyes about the place. It was vast, and yet still inexplicably warm as the rest of the keep so far appeared to be. "Sorry I didn't come out and greet you," he said sincerely. "The people still stare." "That's no matter," Ursula said, her mouth suddenly dry. She swallowed hard, trying to think of something else to say. "I know you might not believe me, but I was truly glad to hear that you had woken after," she trailed off, seeing the dark look that crossed his features. "Why would I not believe you?" he asked after a moment of silence that Ursula found excruciatingly painful. "Given how you came to have your fall," she said quietly, her eyes finding the floor as her fists clenched tightly. "You didn't push me," Princess Bran said quietly, and his words gave her the courage to lift her head and meet his gaze again. "No," she agreed, "but I know how much harm my family has caused to you, irreparable damage. You cannot take responsibility for any of it, none of us can help our name," Bran told her firmly. "It would be like me being given credit for slaying a dragon. I cannot take the credit for Rob's achievements just because I have the Stark name, no more than you can take the blame for any of your family's misconduct." She raised her brows at the word misconduct, thinking that Bran was being far more diplomatic than he had cause to be. "Thank you, my lord, truly, you have no idea at all how much your words mean to me," she told him, her eyes holding his the entire time she spoke. "Rob ought to have been here to greet you," he said sadly after a moment of just looking at her. "I'm sorry that he wasn't," he smiled slightly. "I'm sure he has much to contend with, what with winter on the way again," she said, hoping she sounded unaffected. "Besides, you ought not to take responsibility for your brother's absence," she went on, her tone slightly teasing now. She was thrilled when Bran grinned at her. It almost felt like the past 8 years had been erased and that they were children again with no cares in the world. It may have been delusional, but Ursula was determined to hold on to that feeling for as long as possible. "What is it you're studying?" she asked him curiously, taking a step closer to the desk he was sat at. "Come closer," he beckoned her forwards, and she did as he bid, coming to lean over the desk so she could better see the papers and books he had strewn over it. "Stars?" she questioned him, and he nodded his head. "You know, there are some in the world who believe our futures can be told from them," Bran informed her, and her lips quirked up slightly. "How fascinating. Do you believe it?" she inquired, turning her head to see his own lips twitch into a smile. "I have far more study to do before I can make a decision on that," he told her, and her smile widened. "Yes, I suppose you do," she said faintly, looking at the piles of books and papers he had before him. "If I conclude it true, perhaps I could reveal your future, Princess," he said. Though his tone was teasing, it had Ursula's stomach clenching tightly again. "I am not sure I would want to know," she said quietly, averting her eyes, but not before she had seen the frown crease his brow. "I believe you will have a happy future, Princess," he said just as quietly. "Good people deserve happy futures." Chapter 5, 4, Awkward Encounters. Notes. Thank you all for the lovely comments, really great to see such positive feedback on this. As I've said before, I've never written Ursula before, so it's really gratifying to know you like what I'm doing so far. The big meat is upon us this chapter, hope you all enjoy it, and thanks to everyone who left kudos and pushed me over the 100 mark already. Much appreciated, all of you. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Robb. Robb rode stiffly in his saddle as they passed beneath the gates of Winterfell. He was not anticipating a welcome reception from his mother. Her letter had reached them the night before as they had feasted with the Sawins. It had been a spontaneous decision, one Robb had taken to extend his absence by another night. He would not tell his mother that though, she was furious enough with him as it was. Ursula had arrived, by now she would have been at Winterfell near an entire week. An entire week closer to her becoming my wife. Robb shook his head. The wedding was the last thing he wanted to think of as he trotted his horse into the courtyard. His eyes uneasily scanned the area for any hint of golden hair, but he saw none. The moment of relief he felt at that was quelled in an instant when he found his mother stood waiting for him on the steps with her arms folded and her eyes murderous. He dismounted his horse with a sigh, and decided that he may as well get the scolding over with. He handed the reins of his horse to Billy before he approached the keep, hoping that his expression did not betray his apprehension. "Inside please, Mother," he said quietly as he reached the bottom of the steps. She made no reply, merely inclined her head curtly before she turned and followed him through the doors and into the keep. The guards murmured their greetings and he forced smiles for them, leading his mother across the entrance hall and down the hallway that led to his father's study. Even after all these years, Robb could not bear to describe it as his. It was all his father's things that decorated the place, his presence still overwhelmingly powerful. Robb vaguely wondered if it would ever fade, ashamed of himself for almost wishing that it would. He sighed. Now was not the time to think of his father, not when he was about to be torn apart by his mother. He opened the door of the study and gestured for her to walk in first. She did as he had bid, striding in purposefully. He steeled himself before entering himself and closing the door firmly behind him. "I trust you're well, Mother," he forced his voice to come out normally, trying to seem unaffected as he crossed to the side table to pour a glass of wine. "Would you care for some?" he asked her, beginning to feel unnerved by her silence now. Her eyes flashed at his question, and he knew that he was in for a rough time. "I would have thought that you had more pressing matters to attend to than drinking wine and exchanging pleasantries with your mother," she said icily, but he continued pouring the wine nonetheless. "What could be more important than you, Mother?" he asked, passing a glass to her. She did not look impressed. "You know very well," she said sternly. He decided against replying, likely whatever he said would wind her up even more. Instead he took a long drink from his glass, savoring the sharpness of the wine on his tongue. "Does it not even occur to you to ask after her? To inquire whether or not she arrived safely?" his mother asked him incredulously, and he took another drink before answering her. "I know very well, your letter informed me," he said dryly, and for a moment he honestly thought that his mother might strike him. "I did not raise you, She shook her head, her eyes furious. Your father did not raise you to behave this way. This is not the man you are, so cold and unaffected and compassionless. What did you expect? He snapped at her. Did you expect me to arrive back and fall to my knees at her feet to beg her forgiveness for my inattentiveness? Did you expect me to kiss her hand and smile and tell her how pleased I am that she has arrived safely? Is that what you want, mother? You want me to lie to her, when you and father always raised me to tell the truth? I do not want you to lie to her, his mother snarled, but I expected that you would at least remember to show some common courtesy. Do you know what it has been like this past week? She asked. He remained silent, knowing she would tell him whether he answered or not. Arya has been as stubborn as you, refusing to even acknowledge her. Rukan has always been a shy boy, but at his age now you know damn well that it can be mistaken for rudeness. By the gods, if it were not for Bran then I don't know what I would. Bran. Robb cut her off mid-tirade, his attention caught now. Yes, Bran, she confirmed irritably, he has been spending time with her, keeping her occupied and helping her settle. In short, Robb Stark, he is doing all the things that you ought to be. He ignored that final comment, his mind spinning at the thought of Bran, of all people, wanting to spend time with Myrcella. Why? He finally asked, unable to make any sense of it. Because he, unlike you, understands that Myrcella has done no wrong to us, his mother told him calmly, and for the first time, Robb felt shame at his actions. Where is she? He asked quietly after a deep breath. She went to take a walk in the gardens, his mother told him. I didn't deter her from it. After all, why should she bother to greet you when you could not bother to show her the same courtesy? Robb ignored that jibe, draining his glass before slamming it down on the side table. He turned back to his mother, stepping towards her and pressing a kiss to her cheek. Thank you, mother, he said. If that didn't thaw her then he didn't know what would. Before she could make any comment he had let himself out of the study and was striding back down the hallway. He refused to let his mind needle at him as he was let back out into the courtyard, refusing to look at any of the men who were still milling about the place. His destination was the gardens, and he refused to think of anything else, especially of who was waiting for him out there. He tried not to let the fact that she was spending time with Bran needle at him, tried not to suspect her, to imagine that she was playing a game rather than simply being kind. He bashed his way through the gate more forcefully than he had intended, somewhat surprised that he didn't rip the delicate gate from its hinges. Down the gravel path he went, the crunching sound numbing his mind as he strode down it, his eyes searching for any sign of her. He came to a halt when he finally caught a glimpse of her. She had strayed from the path, wandering the perimeter of the western wall. She paused as he watched her, her attention caught not by him but by something growing in the garden. He straightened his doublet subconsciously before he made his way towards her, trying to keep his footsteps light as he made his way onto the grass. His eyes found what her attention had been caught by and he watched as she reached her hand out to touch it. He found the words to stop her in her tracks before she could do so. It's a thistle, he told her, and she visibly jumped, turning to face him with wide eyes. A pretty enough flower, he continued, but the spines can leave a nasty sting. She appeared at a loss for words, and so he allowed his eyes to appraise her while she found her voice. He couldn't deny her beauty. As a man, he would be a fool to deny it. She was very much her mother's daughter, stood there so effortless, poised and graceful. Robb couldn't help but let his eyes wander the curve of her neck before they followed the progress of one of her light gold curls that ended just above her waist. Her body was swathed in a cloak, but he could tell that she was slim, and no doubt curved in all the right places. He moved his eyes to hers, and she finally seemed to come to her senses. Your Grace, she dropped into a low curtsy. Please forgive me, I was not expecting, I didn't know you were. Why would you greet me when I was absent for your own arrival? He tried to sound jovial, but his voice came out more coldly than he had anticipated. I ought to have been there, she gabbled out at once. I meant no offense to you, Your Grace. I know your own absence was unavoidable, and I know that you must have a great deal to attend to, what with winter coming again. I do hope you can forgive my unintended rudeness. Again she dropped into a curtsy, and Robb now felt immensely uncomfortable. She was so well spoken, and she sounded so sincerely sorry, that he now found himself shifting nervously from foot to foot. Please, Princess, he said awkwardly, I did not mean to sound accusing, Perhaps it is my northern tones, I meant it as a jape. Oh, she flushed scarlet, her hands clenching around her cloak as she drew it further around her as she straightened up again. You really ought to wear gloves, he told her, unable to think of anything else to say, and desperate to change the subject. Oh, she said again, her eyes fluttering to her hands. I had not even thought of it, Your Grace. He took a step closer to her, forcing himself to hold out his hand. She seemed surprised at his gesture, hesitantly outstretching her own hand to him. He took it, feeling it slightly cold but not excessively so. He noted the softness despite himself, swallowing hard before he bent to press a light kiss to the back of it. When he raised his head back up, he met her eyes, seeing her gazing at him intently. He swallowed hard before he dropped her hand. I won't keep you any longer, he said abruptly. I hope you enjoy the rest of your walk. With that he turned and walked away before she had the chance to say anything in return. He cursed himself the entire way back up the path, knowing that he really ought to have offered to show her the rest of the gardens. This was all too much for him, meeting her in the flesh. Properly. He still resented the fact that he would have to marry her within mere weeks, but a tiny part of him had wanted her out there in the gardens. It's because she's beautiful, he told himself, his hands clenching and unclenching as he moved to pass through the gate again. She's beautiful, and I have been too long without a woman. He refused to acknowledge any other explanation. There was no other explanation. At least he knew he would be able to do his duty by her when the time came. He straightened his doublet again and strode purposefully towards the direction of the keep. Arya emerged from the alleyway that led towards the tiltyard on his journey across the courtyard, and he scowled, seeing that damn sword on her hip again. If he had told her once, he had told her 1,000 times. Their mother would always explode if Arya dared enter the keep armed. She tolerated her practicing in the tiltyard, but that was as far as it went. Of course, compromise did not seem to be a word in Arya's vocabulary. He sighed, already knowing how the ensuing argument would go. Really, he didn't care if Arya wore the sword in the keep, but he knew that he would be the one getting it in the neck if their mother caught her. He folded his arms at her approach, but she merely grinned at him, her eyes dancing mischievously. Do you not think I have enough to contend with without you taking that thing inside with you? He asked her pointedly as she came to a halt a few feet from him. Missed you too, Arya said in an affronted manner, and he rolled his eyes. Just this once, please. I've already had one earful from Mother, and I would like to make it to the end of the day without another. His tone must have been convincingly pleading, because Arya's eyes softened, and she huffed in what he knew to be grudging agreement. Fine, she said exasperatedly. Was your scolding to do with the princess? She spoke Mercilla's title mockingly, and Rob sighed. What else? He said moodily, and she smiled sympathetically at him. Mother has been trying to get us all to get to know her, but what good will that do? Arya raised a brow. I cannot imagine us having any common interests. You don't have any common interests with any woman. Rob rolled his eyes in response, and Arya glared at him. That's not true, she said indignantly, and he grinned at her. Name one, he challenged her, and she glowered even more furiously in response. You know, I was glad you'd come home. Now I'm not so sure, she said darkly, and he couldn't help but laugh. Leave it to Arya to take his mind away from his troubles. Take it back to the tiltyard and I'll spar with you in the morning. He nodded towards her sword, and her scowl turned into a delighted grin at once. Thank you, she exclaimed, turning at once to make her way back. Halfway across the courtyard she turned back to him and smiled widely. I am glad you're back, really, she called out, and he chuckled, shaking his head. I should think so too, he retorted, before he himself turned and made for the keep once more. Again he inclined his head to the guards, smiling as best he could for them before he made his way back towards his father's study. He let himself in, not bothering to close the door properly behind him, before crossing to the side table again and pouring another glass of wine. When he brought it to his lips he sucked half of it down at once, his hands shaking slightly. How did it go? He jumped at his mother's voice, spilling a few drops of wine over his hand. He turned, seeing her sat in the corner with her hands neatly folded in her lap. What are you still doing here? He asked bluntly in return, ignoring her question. I assumed you'd be back, she said simply, raising a brow. He ignored her, turning his attention back to his wine and drinking down another quarter of it. Did she say something to offend you? his mother persisted, and he glared at her before turning to top up his glass. No, he said moodily, taking another long drink. Do you wish she had? She asked next, her eyes boring into his when he finally managed to meet them. Why would I wish that? He countered, and she shrugged her shoulders slightly. Because it is no secret that you wish this marriage didn't have to take place, she said calmly, and I wouldn't be surprised if you had already decided not to like her before you went out to the gardens. Rob merely scowled. Sometimes he really did despise his mother's astuteness. I can only assume from your silence that I'm right, she said lightly, and from your mood I can only assume you didn't find anything displeasing about your future wife. He ignored her again, gulping down some more wine and wishing that she wasn't right. It was true, there was nothing displeasing about Ursula, but her family. Her blood. That was something he could not bring himself to set aside, and he wondered if he ever would be able to. What are you so afraid of? His mother asked him softly, almost pleadingly. She was standing now, hesitating mere feet from him, as though she herself was afraid of coming any closer. Do you really want to know? He asked her, meeting her eyes that were the same ones that stared back at him in the mirror. Yes, she nodded, of course I do. I am your mother, Rob. If you cannot confide in me, then I'm not doing my duty properly. He sighed at that, guilt nagging at his stomach again. His mother had an uncanny way of making him feel bad by implying that she was failing as a mother. It could not be further from the truth, and it was a sure way to make him tell her exactly what was playing on his mind and weighing heavily in his chest. I'm afraid, he started, taking a deep breath. I'm afraid that if we have a child, he tailed off, unable to form the words, bringing his glass to his lips again and drinking the rest of the wine. If you have a child, what? His mother prompted him as he set the empty glass down with slightly more force than necessary. That I won't love it, he said quickly, as though by blurting the words out he could make them sound any less hideous. Why? She asked him, her eyes wide and pleading. He ran his hand through his hair and shook his head. Because of her, he shrugged his shoulders. Because of who she is. Rob, you cannot think this way, his mother began in soothing tones, but he had no desire to hear her reassurances. I can't help it, he burst out. All I can think of is Lannister. When I looked at her, it is all I could see. I am supposed to share a life with her, my bed with her. She will be the mother of my children, and he cut off, struggling with the words. Rob. They will be half her, he shot across her. They will have her blood in their veins. The same blood that flowed in Joffrey's veins. My children, my sons and daughters will share the blood of that monster who murdered my father. How am I supposed to live with that? Rob. Don't think you can coddle me with this, mother. Again he shot her down, but this time she shook her head insistently, her eyes fixed on something over his shoulder. He turned, closing his eyes in despair when he saw who was stood there. Princess, he began vaguely, not even sure how he was supposed to explain himself in this situation. May I say something, Your Grace? She asked him quietly, her expression smooth. He nodded mutely, and she inclined her head in response. I understand why you would not want me as your wife, as the mother of your children, she began, and he felt horrible. I know what harm my family has caused to yours. But you signed the treaty with my grandfather all those years ago, and you knew that you would eventually have to take me as your queen. You did not ask for it, I know, but you still agreed to it. I know why, to end the war and the suffering of your people, and I think you are honorable and brave for putting their lives and the future of your kingdom before your own happiness. She paused to take a breath, and Rob wished he could stop her. Each word from her mouth made him curse himself more and more, but he could find no words, much less his voice, and so she continued, looking him dead in the eye as she did so. But still you said yes, she said, a harder edge to her voice now. You said yes, you agreed, and you signed your name on the treaty. Do you think anyone ever asked me if I agreed? Do you think they asked my permission to sign away my future? My grandfather did it all on my behalf. He consented for me, and I sat before him meekly with my head bowed while he told me what was to become of me. There was no opportunity to say no, no room for negotiation. It had all been decided between him and you, and that was that. I am sorry that it has all become too real for you now that I am here, but I'm begging you, Your Grace, do not make the mistake of thinking that this is easy for me. I may be a princess from a rich family, but the greatest decision I have ever made by myself is what to wear for my brother's wedding. You chose this future for me, and if I can live with it then, with respect, your grace, I believe you ought to find a way to do the same. Rob swallowed hard as she came to the end of her speech, her eyes still on his and shining with tears now. Her voice had shaken at the end, but he could not help but admire the way she was holding herself together, refusing to give in to her emotions. He took a deep breath, trying to find some words in his head that would not make it all worse. An apology didn't seem enough. Ursula dropped her eyes from his in the next instant, dropping into a slight curtsy before she raised them back to meet his once more. "Thank you for hearing me, Your Grace," she said quietly, before she turned gracefully on the spot and walked from the room. Evidently she had assumed he had nothing to say to her. Part of him wanted to call her back, to offer her his apology, even if it would be a feeble attempt. He didn't. He just closed his eyes and took a deep breath, waiting for the onslaught that his mother would no doubt begin once she was sure Ursula was out of earshot. "Well done," she said dryly, and he sighed heavily before turning back to face her. "How much did she hear?" Rob asked her, knowing he would likely regret asking. "I would say she heard more than enough," his mother said, her eyes furious as she met his. "Go on then," he said in a resigned manner, "hit me with it." His mother contemplated him for a long moment, her eyes slowly softening as the seconds ticked by. "I have nothing to say," she said quietly, a sad little smile coming to adorn her lips. "I think Ursula said it all perfectly, and I think you ought to think hard on her words, Rob Stark. This is not all about you, and I did not raise you to be so selfish." Chapter 6, The Doll. Notes. Oh my wow. I don't even know where to start with thanking you all, so I will start off with this. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Honestly, getting your feedback is amazing. I will try and answer a few things that came up, so bear with me a moment. Tushwolf howling, yes, Sangza will certainly be making an appearance, and soon at that winking smiley. Today-oable, yes, cheesy as it is, the person I have in mind is Lily James. Just, her innocence is perfection, and just how I imagine Ursula to be. The Cinderella part helps too, haha winking smiley. And of course, a million thank yous again to everyone else. You're all amazing. Oh, and thank you for the kudos as well, I love the kudos. Anyway, hope you enjoy the new chapter. Chapter text. Ursula. Ursula's stomach snarled with hunger, but she could still not bring herself to leave her chamber and make the journey into the great hall for breakfast. She had missed dinner the night before as well, but she hadn't minded, her stomach had been fluttering too nervously for her to even consider food. Part of her could still not believe the words she had spoken to the king, and she had had a fitful sleep. Dreaming of all sorts when she did sleep, and spending the entire time fretting about what she had done when she was awake. She had overstepped the mark, she knew she had. If her mother had ever spoken that way to her father, then she had no doubt that she would have ended up with a bruised cheek. Ursula raised her own hand to her cheek, wondering if the king would ever strike her. She swallowed hard and promised herself that she would never again give him cause to. If she were braver, then she liked to think that she would have gone down to his study and offered up her apology. She was not braver though, and so she stayed hidden in her chamber, wondering if it would occur to anyone that she had not eaten in almost a full day. Self-consciously she smoothed her skirts, twisting her hands together as she resumed her slow pacing of the room. Perhaps she could wait until she was sure that everyone had finished breaking their fast and then sneak down to the kitchens and hope they had some scraps left. She sighed. Is this what she had been reduced to? Contemplating going begging to the cooks like some beggar girl. She shook her head and met her own eyes in the mirror. She was Ursula Baratheon, Princess of the Southern Kingdoms. If she could not bring herself to walk into the great hall and face the presence of the king, then what hope did she have? Just as she had resolved to pull herself together and walk down there, a knock came at the door. She hesitated, playing with her skirts again as she wondered who could possibly have come. In the end she made for the door and wrenched it open, prepared to fall to her knees and beg forgiveness if it was indeed the king who had come. She faltered when she recognized her visitor, her lips breaking into a smile despite her inner turmoil. Sangza, she was so surprised and elated that she forgot all propriety and practically launched herself at the older woman. Sangza held her back tightly and Ursula closed her eyes fast to prevent the tears from coming. Eventually Sangza gently prized her away, considering her face for a moment before she ushered her back inside her chamber, following on behind. My mother thought you might be hungry, Sangza said after she closed the door. One of the servants will be up soon with some breakfast for you. Thank you, Ursula said, the only words she could say. Rob is in a foul mood, Sangza said lightly, crossing to the window and pulling the drapes aside. He has barely said 2 words to me since I arrived, she continued, and even the girls haven't managed to put a smile on his face. Sangza's voice remained calm and light, but Ursula could sense the underlying questions. Likely that is my fault, Ursula said, and Sangza turned from looking out of the window, a sympathetic smile on her face. Mother didn't say much, but she said enough that I know you had words yesterday, Sangza said kindly, raising her brow expectantly. The words were all mine, my lady, Ursula told her miserably, and Sangza tutted, coming closer to her and ushering her into one of the chairs. Sangza is preferable, Sangza corrected her with a raised brow, and Ursula managed a weak smile in response. I'm so glad to see you, Ursula burst out before she could stop herself. Truly, I am. I had no idea that you were coming and, well, I am so glad to see it with my own eyes how happy you are. She managed a real smile at the end, and Sangza beamed back, coming to take the chair opposite her. I'm sorry I never wrote, Sangza said sincerely. I would have liked to, but Rob seemed to think you would never get them. Likely he was right, Ursula said dully, dropping her head into her hands and massaging her temples. Whatever you said yesterday, I don't think Rob is angry with you, Sangza said, and she looked up hopefully. Really? She asked incredulously, and Sangza smiled. I know my brother well enough, Sangza nodded, and I know when he is angry with someone around him, and when he is angry with himself. Believe me, on this occasion, he is most certainly angry with himself. I said too much, things I really ought not to have done, but I just couldn't help it, Ursula trailed off, shaking her head before dropping it heavily back into her hands. Believe me, whatever you said was deserved, or so my mother tells me, Sangza reassured her, and she snorted in a rather undignified manner. Trust me, Sangza soothed, Rob can be as stubborn as a mule on occasion, but he will not be so cold forever. He cannot blind himself to you forever, eventually he will work out that you are nothing like he feared. You just have to be patient, and learn not to take his moods personally. He will get better, he just needs to open his eyes and see the real you. What if he doesn't like the real me? Ursula asked her dully, and Sangza moved her hand underneath her chin to coax her head up again. If he does not, he is a fool, Sangza said firmly. Don't think I never saw what you did, how you stood up for Tommen against Joffrey. You were the only person in that place who was not afraid of him. You have a good heart, Ursula. Rob will realize that eventually. Sometimes it just takes a man a little while to catch up to what we ladies already know. I think you're overestimating me, Sangza. Ursula smiled slightly. Joffrey terrified me. She had never admitted that to anyone before, and it felt good to let someone else know, and ever so easy to confess it to Sangza. She had suffered her own torment at Joffrey's hands, and yet she sat before her now, so wise and happy and strong. But you never let it show. Sangza reached forward to take one of her hands. You are stronger than you give yourself credit for, just be yourself and Rob will come around, I promise you. Sangza looked so certain that a little part of Ursula couldn't help but believe her. I really am so glad you're here, she smiled, and Sangza returned it. Gods, I almost forgot, I have something for you. Ursula prized her hand from Sangza's and stood up, crossing the room to the dresser standing opposite. For me? Sangza asked curiously as Ursula opened the dresser and knelt down so she could pull the box from the bottom where she had stored it. I was not expecting anything, Ursula. I do hope you didn't go to any trouble or expense. Sangza was worrying at her bottom lip as Ursula approached her, setting the box down on the table in front of her. Neither, she promised. It has always been yours. I have just been holding on to it for you until such time I could get it back to you. I meant to get it to you before you went from the capital, but everything happened so quickly and I never got the chance. It doesn't matter now though, better late than never. Open it, Ursula urged her, and Sangza did as she was bid, sliding the lid from the box. She folded back the material Ursula had wrapped her gift in, her eyes welling with tears at once when she saw what was inside. Is this? Sangza stood, her eyes disbelieving as she gazed down into the box. The doll your father got you at the capital, Ursula confirmed quietly, seeing the older woman's hands shake slightly as she reached them into the box. I was so ungrateful, Sangza whispered, lifting up the doll and staring at it incredulously. Hateful, she continued, her voice full of regret. I'm sure your father knew you didn't mean it, Ursula said soothingly, and Sangza nodded slightly, her eyes still fixed on the doll. How did you get this? She asked after a long moment, her eyes flickering towards Ursula now. Your father came across me in the keep one day, he had the doll with him and he offered it to me, Ursula told her, and Sangza smiled weakly. And you kept it? All this time she was shaking her head slightly. I always wanted to get it back to you after, Ursula paused awkwardly, after what happened, only, there never seemed to be a right time and I was afraid to be caught. So I kept it safe, and when I discovered that one day I would wed the king, well, I knew that I would be able to return it to you eventually. Sangza bit down on her lip and Ursula saw a single tear leak from her eye. Perhaps your girls would like it, a gift from their grandfather, Ursula said softly, and Sangza nodded weakly. You have no idea what this means to me, she said. Truly, Ursula, this is the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me, thank you. Ursula paused in the entrance hall to compose herself, taking a deep breath and smoothing out the skirts of her dress. She rearranged her fur stole about her neck and conjured up all of Sangza's soothing words in her head. Somehow she forced her hands to come still at her sides instead of twisting around one another nervously. Finally, before she could duck out and flee back to her room, she raised her head high and walked purposefully through the double doors that led into the dining hall. It was full of people, but the happy murmur and chatter seemed to dim just a fraction when she walked in. She tried not to notice the way people would put their heads together and whisper behind their hands as she walked by. It would be better for her if she didn't know what they were saying about her. She knew that the words would not be favorable ones. Instead she kept her eyes on the high table, seeking out an empty place, and finally seeing one on the end, next to Bran. Once she was married, her rightful place would be to the right of the king, but his mother occupied that space at present, and though Ursula imagined that Lady Stark would gladly give it up, she felt it likely that the king would not have asked her to. Besides, she couldn't help but feel as though it may be the best thing for both of them to put a little distance between them for the time being so they could both sort out what was within their heads. With another calming breath she confidently approached the space next to Bran, wondering if she was imagining the quiet, insistent tones of Lady Stark. May I? She asked Bran brightly when she reached his side. Of course, Princess, he smiled widely at her. I would pull your chair out for you, if I were able. He didn't say the words with bitterness, rather with a teasing undertone, and a flickering glance towards his older brother. Ursula pretended she hadn't noticed the look, and she herself refused to glance at the king. Instead, she merely smiled widely at Bran before pulling the chair out herself and sliding into place. Her nerves were piqued enough without her heaping more humiliation on herself by standing stupidly in the vain hope that the king might get up and pull her chair out for her. Thank you, she said to Bran in an undertone as she settled herself in her seat. He merely inclined his head in response as a servant approached to pour wine into Ursula's waiting glass. She thanked the girl when she was done, gaining a rather cold smile in response before the girl scurried back out of sight. Ursula vaguely wondered what tales she would spin to the other kitchen maids later once the feasting was over. She quickly decided that she didn't care, she had enough troubles to contend with regarding her coming marriage. Are you still studying your stars, Bran? Ursula politely inquired, reaching forward to take a sip of her wine, hoping that the action would quell the shake in her hands. Yes, he replied, though I must confess, I do not think I am able yet to decipher the future. He grinned at that, and she couldn't help but laugh lightly. Another week and I imagined you will know all there is to know, she said certainly, and it was his turn to laugh. You know, I found a book that you might like, Bran said, and she turned to him in surprise. Really? She asked, a slight smile playing about her lips. I remembered the last time you came that you enjoyed reading about adventures, he said. They are all tales from the north, so I thought you may not have read them. Thank you, Bran, she said sincerely, that is ever so thoughtful of you. He merely smiled and nodded slightly in response, leaning forward in his own chair to reach his own glass of wine. His action created a clear gap through which Ursula saw the king quickly looking away from their direction. She swallowed hard and averted her own eyes, her heart thumping in her chest. Come to the library tomorrow and collect it, if you'd like, Bran spoke again as he leaned back in his chair, the servants pouring in now to lay out their dinner for the night. I will, she said simply as various serving dishes were placed before them. Bran insisted that she serve herself first, and so she did, pulling some meat and various vegetables onto her plate before drizzling a little gravy over her meal. There was relative silence within the dining hall as everyone ate, just a low buzz of chatter and the occasional burst of raucous laughter from one table or another. The atmosphere was so relaxed here, Ursula just wished that she could feel the same. As she ate, she was constantly paranoid that the king was looking at her, the tension in her rising higher as she thought of all the things that he himself could be thinking. She ate as quickly as she could without appearing unladylike, laying her knife and fork neatly across her empty plate when she was finished. As she reached for her wine, she chanced to glance to her right and was pleased to see that she was not the only one who had cleared her plate. She sucked down what was left of her wine before she leaned slightly closer to Bran. "Forgive me, I think I am going to retire for the night," she told him quietly. "Already? Would you not stay for the sweet course?" he asked her, a slight frown creasing his brow. "No," she shook her head, "I do not have the appetite for it." Bran seemed to understand, his head nodding slowly and his eyes searching her for a moment. "I know you might not believe it now," he murmured, "but it will get better." She tried to smile at his words, hating the fact that hearing them made her eyes sting. "Thank you," she managed, "I will see you tomorrow, to get that book." She nodded determinedly, and he inclined his head in turn. "Good night, Ursula," he smiled, his hand hesitantly coming to rest on hers for a moment. "Good night, Bran." Somehow she managed another smile before she slipped out of her chair. She decided to skirt the edge of the dining hall, having no desire to walk through the middle again and have everyone staring and whispering. A few noticed her as she passed, but thankfully not many heads turned and she was soon safely back out in the entrance hall. Gods! She took a deep breath before making for the stairs. She knew that Sansa and Lady Stark had meant well, convincing her to join everyone for dinner, but Ursula already knew that there was little chance of her doing so again. Not unless the king showed any inclination at all that he would like her to. She almost laughed at that, a tiny snort escaping her as she made her way down the hallway towards her chamber. Once inside, she began loosening the ties of her dress, shrugging her stole to the floor and crossing to the bed. She pulled back the layers of furs and pulled out her nightdress, which she kept beneath them to keep warm. Once her dress and shift fell to the floor, she shivered slightly despite the fire in the grate. Quickly she pulled the nightdress over her head and padded towards the hearth. The fire was going well enough, but she had learned quickly that if she did not stock it well with wood before going to sleep, that her chamber would be freezing cold come morning. She threw as many logs into the grate as would fit, wondering what her mother would say if she could see her tending to her own fire. The thought made her smile wryly as she rose back to her feet and turned towards bed. She had barely laid a hand on the furs when a soft knock came at the door. A frown creased her brow at once, and she quickly moved to take her robe down from the hook and wrap it around her. Once it was securely tied, she went to open the door, blinking stupidly when she saw who was on the other side. "Your Grace," she finally found her voice and her manners, dropping into a curtsy before him. "Please, there is no need," he said awkwardly, and she rose back up, her cheeks burning. "I wasn't expecting you," she stuttered out, lifting her eyes again, this time noticing that he had Sansa's doll in his possession. She couldn't help but frown, and he clearly noticed, an odd half-smile twitching at his lips. "May I?" he nodded through the door, and she hesitated. She knew it was not right for a man to be in a lady's chambers beyond a certain hour, especially when said lady was in her nightclothes. This was no mere man though, it was the king in the north. Her betrothed. She swallowed hard before nodding shyly, stepping aside to allow him to stride in. Again she hesitated, taking a calming breath before she closed the door and turned to face the king. "Sansa gave it to me." He looked down at the doll, and Ursula followed his line of sight, seeing how his knuckles were stretched white where he was holding it so tightly. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. The king stepped a little closer to her at her question, and she raised her head and forced herself to meet his piercing blue gaze. "She was genuinely touched by your gift," the king told her sincerely, but the longer she had in her possession, the more memories came back for her that she would rather not think on. "Oh," Ursula said in a tiny voice, her eyes stinging again. "It was a truly kind thing you did," he continued as she averted her eyes, but she did not think she could stand to see her daughters playing with it. Though it was no fault of hers, she still blames herself for our father's death, and she torments herself over how she treated him at the capital. Ursula swallowed hard, though his words were soft and reassuring she could not help but feel terrible for conjuring up so many awful memories for Sangza. She had truly thought she had been doing her a kindness. She took a shuddering breath before she raised her eyes to the king's again. "I will apologize to her tomorrow, Your Grace, you have my word," she promised him, and he frowned. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said, shaking his head. "You did something nice and thoughtful. You could not have known how it would be received, and I assure you, Sangza is not seeking an apology. If anything, she asked me to apologize to you if you thought her ungrateful." Myrsilla's eyes widened at that, and she shook her head firmly. "No," she said, "no, that is the last thing I think. Lady Sangza has been most kind to me, the last thing I wanted was to cause her any upset." "Then it appears the only one of us with an apology to make is myself," he said quietly, and she couldn't help but stare at him. "Your Grace," her tone was questioning, her heart pounding irrationally hard in her chest. "I said some unforgivable things yesterday," he said. "I never meant for you to overhear them, though that is no excuse. I should have never uttered them in the first place, it was selfish and unkind of me. I can only hope that you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Myrcilla could do nothing but stare at him for a long moment, before she finally came to her senses, blinking rather rapidly. "Yes," she said. "No," she added quickly, "I mean, no, there is nothing to forgive, Your Grace. I ought to apologize to you for what I said, I ought to have held my tongue. It was not right for me to speak to you the way I did." "On the contrary, what you said was entirely right," he countered. "I have spent far too much time lamenting the future I could have had when this is the one I agreed to. I'm afraid I have been altogether too selfish to consider your own feelings, and the fact that you had no say in the arrangement whatsoever. Though many tried to make me see it, I refused to hear them, but I heard you last night, Princess. I truly am sorry." Perhaps Myrcilla bit her lip, seeing his eyes soft on hers as she met them. "Perhaps we could start again," she suggested tentatively, hesitating for a moment before she shakily outstretched her hand to him. She was beyond relieved when he moved his own to take it. Out in the gardens she had been too surprised to note how his skin felt on hers, but now she noted it to be rough and calloused, though ever so warm. "Your hands are warmer today," he commented in an amused tone, and she couldn't help but smile. His own lips twitched slightly in response, before he bent his head to press a kiss to the back of her hand for the second time. This time his lips lingered long enough for her to notice their softness, and the tickly warmth of his breath on her skin. When he pulled back he didn't drop her hand right away, instead he tugged lightly on it and pulled her back towards the bed. Her heart pounded wildly, not quite sure what he was doing, but suddenly very aware of the fact that she was only clad in her nightclothes. Just as she was about to panic, and wondering how she would ever speak up to question him, he let go of her hand and lowered himself onto the end of her bed. Her heartbeat slowly began to return to normal, and she almost laughed in relief as he patted the space next to him. She moved to sit, suddenly nervous again, and unsure of what to do with her hands. The king answered that silent conundrum in the next moment. "Here," he said softly, passing the doll back to her. She took it, her hands shaking slightly as she did so. "Would you tell me how you got it?" he asked, his tone almost longing. "Why, my father gave it to you." "I was upset," she told him honestly. "Why?" the king inquired, and she smiled wryly. "Back then there was only ever one reason for anyone to be upset," she said bitterly. "Joffrey," she added when she caught sight of the king's frown. Understanding crossed his features, and she could see the sympathy in his eyes. Though they were a different color entirely, she could see his father deep within them. "Your father came across me," she continued. "I tried to hide my upset, but I could tell that he did not believe me when I told him I was fine. He had the doll with him and so he offered it to me. He said that Sansa was too old for it and Arya had never had any patience for them. He said it would only go to waste if I didn't have it, and so I took it. That was the end of it. He gave me the doll, placed his hand on my shoulder, and that was the last time I ever spoke to him." "And you kept it?" the king said quietly, almost disbelievingly. "Yes," she confirmed, her fingers playing with the fabric of the dress that the doll was clad in. "After," she hesitated, biting down on her lip. "After what happened?" she said meaningfully. I didn't dare play with it anymore, in case my mother saw it. I could never lie to her, and if she had discovered that Lord Stark had given it to me then I don't doubt she would have taken it away." So I put it in a box, and I vowed that one day I would get it back to Sangza. The king was silent when she came to the end, and she dared turn her head to look at him, seeing him already watching her. Slowly he moved to take her hand again. This time he didn't bring it to his lips, merely squeezed it lightly in his own for a moment before he spoke. "Thank you," he said simply, "truly, thank you." Chapter 7, 6, Starting Afresh. Notes. New chapter. I know I probably sound like a broken record by now, but thank you so very much to everyone who has left comments and kudos. Really does mean a lot, as I keep saying haha. Some questions cropped up again, so I shall do my best to answer them below. Yes, there will be a bit more detail about Sansa and Oliver, but not just yet. The Northern Lords have known for 8 years that she would be their queen, so there isn't much I can do in the way of reaction. They might not be entirely happy about it, but they supported Rob's deal with the Lannisters, and so they will deal with it like he is. Yes, you can assume that Rob does have ice, it would have been returned with Ned's body. I can't see Bolton trying to exert any influence over Myrcella. Besides, with winter coming the lords will all be safely shut up in their own castles. As for Rickon, he's shy, but he will come into his own as the story progresses. Hope that's everything answered. Anyone wants to know anything, go right ahead and ask. If not, I hope you just enjoy the new chapter. Happy Smiley. Chapter text. Rob. Word from Master Hellman, at Torrens Square. Your Grace Maester Lewin reported to him as he sifted through the stack of papers in front of him. What word? Rob inquired, reclining back in his chair lazily with his mind somewhere else entirely. There have been more looters at the winter supplies, the Maester told him, and he sighed heavily, sitting himself up straight in his chair and giving Maester Lewin his full attention. Does he request my presence? He asked, hoping that Master Hellman did not require him to ride back to Torrens Square merely a week after he had left in the first place. No, Your Grace, Maester Lewin told him, but he does beg Your Grace for more coin to recruit more men to the town watch. Can we spare the coin? Rob moved his eyes to Bone, the steward. We could spare a little, Your Grace, he confirmed, perhaps enough to cover 4 more additions to the watch. We could spare more, but with winter on its way again I would advise against it. Rob sighed heavily, nodding his agreement. Very well. Rob drummed his fingertips on the tabletop for a moment. I suppose we have little choice besides riding to Torrens Square ourselves. Right back to Master Hellman please, Maester Lewin, tell him he has leave to recruit 4 more men to the watch, he decided, and if the troubles persist then he must not hesitate to inform us. Very good, Your Grace, Maester Lewin replied, making a note on a sheet of parchment in front of him. What of our own stores? Rob inquired, looking again to Bone and seeing him shuffle around his own stack of papers before he cleared his throat to answer. The main grain store is a little over half full, Your Grace, Bone reported. Fish stocks from White Harbor and Flint's Finger are as normal, though there has been a decrease along the stony shore. Should I be worried? Rob asked, and Bone studied his papers for a moment before answering. I don't believe so, Your Grace, he said, though, if I may, I would advise that you lower the amount they are expected to export each month, that way the people there will not be at a disadvantage. Rob nodded, his agreement. Yes, of course, he voiced. Is there anything else I ought to be informed of? Again, Bone sifted through his papers, his head shaking from side to side slightly as he read down his lists. No, Your Grace, he said, there is the lack of certain fruits and vegetables, but it is to be expected and cannot be helped. It should not affect the keep. There is a plentiful harvest ready in the glass gardens. Indeed, Rob agreed vaguely, glancing towards Maester Lewin and hoping that he too had no more news for the day. There was also word from the wall, Your Grace, the Maester told him, and he raised his brows expectantly. Nothing serious, he assured him, just a few issues with the wildlings on the gift, a few still seem to be having trouble adjusting to our laws. Rob sighed heavily at that and ran his hand through his hair. The Lord Commander assured it has been dealt with, he just thought you ought to know, Maester Lewin finished, and Rob nodded his head. Good, he said after a moment, I will write to John myself and thank him, you do not need to trouble yourself further with this matter. Maester Lewin inclined his head in response, thanking him. Can I assume there is nothing else? He raised a brow, looking between the Maester and the steward, both of whom shook their heads slightly. Nothing I can think of, Your Grace, Maester Lewin said with a small smile that Rob returned. Nothing of immediate concern, your Grace, Byrne assured him, and he let out a long breath of relief, satisfied. Then I think I can call an end to this council, gentlemen. Thank you as ever for your loyal counsel. Rob smiled again, pushing away from the table and rising to his feet. It is our pleasure, your Grace, Byrne said, and Mayor Stillowin nodded and hummed his agreement. Until next time, Rob said with a raised brow, straightening his doublet as he made his way out of the council chambers. Once he had closed the door behind him, he set off down the hallway, intent on doing enjoyable with his day. As he rounded the corner, his footsteps faltered slightly as he saw Ursula leaving the library, book in hand. He made his way towards her before he could stop himself, determined now to build on the fresh start they had agreed upon the night before, when he had seen a side to her that he had assumed would not exist. Princess, he hailed her as she made to walk in the opposite direction, quickening his pace slightly as she turned to face him. Your Grace, she dipped into an elegant curtsy for him, and he smiled slightly. You ought to stop doing that, he advised her in an amused tone. I have not been curtsied before as much in the past 8 years as I have in the past few days. Forgive me, she said, a small smile on her own face as she straightened up gracefully. There is no need, just don't do it again, he mock scolded her, and her smile widened. I will do my best, she said, her tone slightly teasing, but I cannot promise anything. We Southerners are taught our courtesies well. Are you saying we Northerners are not courteous? He asked in a similar tone, raising his brows. Well, she looked him up and down, an amused smirk on her face. I suppose you are courteous enough, considering you are all wild savages. He couldn't help but laugh at that, seeing her responding smile light up her eyes at his reaction. You surprise me, he chuckled. I did not think that those in the South were renowned for their humor. Who said I was joking? She cocked her head to one side, and he shook his head at her, still chuckling slightly. Did you have any plans for your afternoon, Princess? Rob inquired, deciding to change the subject. I had thought to take this to my chambers. She held up the book in her hand, and then I had thought to perhaps take a walk around Winterfell and reacquaint myself with the sights. Then perhaps I could escort you, Rob suggested, and then I could show you around myself. How better to see the sights than a personal tour from the king? She smiled widely at that, biting down gently on her lower lip as he offered his arm to her. So long as I am not keeping you from anything, Your Grace, she said, hesitating slightly before she lay her hand on his forearm. Not at all, he said easily, turning to lead her down the hallway. I have already attended council today, and I had my mind set on enjoying my afternoon, Rob told her, glancing down to see a faint blush had risen up on her cheeks. Well, I am honored, she said in response, and he smiled slightly as they emerged into the entrance hall and made for the stairs. They didn't speak on the journey to her chambers, but Rob found the silence easy. He had no desire to fill it with inane chat, and he could only assume she felt the same way because she made no attempt at conversation as they walked. Finally they came to her door and she slipped her hand away from his arm. I will not be a moment, Your Grace, she said with a smile, pushing open the door. You ought to get your cloak, there is a stiff wind blowing, he advised her as she disappeared into the room. Thank you, she said, reappearing in the next moment, draping her cloak around her and nimbly closing the fastenings. It's nothing, he returned, offering his arm again. This time she didn't hesitate to take it, and they set off again in perfect step with one another. How much do you remember of Winterfell? Rob asked her curiously once they had descended the stairs and made their way out into the courtyard. Some parts better than others, she answered. I remember the warmth most of all, inside I mean. He chuckled at that, deciding to lead her around the periphery of the yard to keep them sheltered from the worst of the wind. Is it not warm at the capital? He inquired as they ambled slowly around, keeping close to the walls. In temperature, very much, she replied, smiling wryly. I see, he said lightly, deciding not to sour their conversation by bringing up her family. It was hard to relax, Ursula said after a moment. Unless I was with Tommen, it was difficult to be myself. I imagine he is greatly changed from when I last saw him, Rob mused, drifting unconsciously down the alleyway that led to the tiltyard. The tiltyard is down here, isn't it? Ursula asked, looking up at him for confirmation. It is indeed, he nodded, though I am surprised you remember that. I did not realize you spent much time there. Do you remember when Tommen and Bran sparred against one another? She asked him, and he nodded, a regretful smile playing about his lips. He confirmed, nodding his head slightly. All that padding Tommen had to wear, he was twice the size he usually was. Ursula went on, a tiny smile gracing her own lips. Bran bested him easily, she said, and he wasn't sure he was imagining the sadness in her voice. He wondered if she, like he, was remembering how spirited and full of life Bran had been before his accident. It had been so long now, and his brother had come to make peace with his condition. The time when he had just woken still haunted Robb though, and he still heard the words in his head as though they were uttered yesterday. "I'd rather be dead." Everything was easy until it wasn't anymore, Ursula said quietly, and he nodded his head, swallowing hard. Looking back, he trailed off, shaking his head. This is where it all went wrong. His eyes drifted towards the old tower, seeing the top of it rising up behind the armory. So many things went wrong, she said, following his line of sight and tightening her grip on his arm ever so slightly. "And here we are," Robb said softly, smiling slightly wryly. "Making it right." "Do you really think that?" she asked him curiously, and he turned his head so he could look down on her. "The gods only know what would have happened if your grandfather and I had not signed that treaty." He shook his head. "Enough of my men died as it was. It will take many years for the North and the Riverlands to recover their full strength. The South too, I imagine." He inclined his head to her and she nodded her agreement. "I have to believe the treaty saved something," Robb continued. "I have to believe that it did more good than harm." "You got your sisters back," Ursula reminded him quietly, and he nodded his head in agreement. "Yes, I did," he agreed, "and I got you." She was quiet for a moment, and he glanced down at her again, seeing her biting gently on her bottom lip. "And do I come under good, or harm?" she asked, looking up to meet his eyes. He smiled wryly at her, deciding to be honest. "I was always certain it would be the latter," he admitted. "Now though, well, now I am not so sure." Her lips twitched up on one side at that before her attention was caught elsewhere. He followed her line of sight, seeing that Arya had emerged from the armory. She had her sword on her hip and her arms folded as she stood on the step, the look in her eyes almost murderous as she looked towards him and Ursula. "Well, I think you know the way to the Tiltyard," Robb said pointedly. "Why don't we go somewhere else?" "As you wish, Your Grace," she replied, and he waited for her to place her hand back on his arm before setting off back down the alleyway. The wind seemed to have picked up even more, swirling Ursula's hair around her face as they emerged back into the courtyard. "Have you been to the Glass Gardens?" he asked her, thinking she might appreciate going somewhere more sheltered. "No," she replied, and he led her in that direction at once. "I will show you around them," he said. "Likely we will both welcome the relief from this wind." "Will it snow soon?" she asked, looking up at him expectantly. "The first snows are already falling north of here," he replied, "and there is always snow at the wall. I expect we will get some light dusting soon enough, though it will be a while yet before it really begins to settle." Ursula nodded at that, a rather thoughtful expression on her face. Robb wondered what she was thinking, but before he could ask she was speaking again. "The Lady Arya isn't impressed at my arrival, is she?" she asked him, and he couldn't help but grimace slightly. "You noticed," he said, not seeing any point in denying it. "A simpleton would notice," Ursula responded, and he snorted slightly. "Arya is stubborn." He struggled to find the right word. "Like me perhaps, only far worse. She will get used to you being here eventually, I can assure you of that. Perhaps when we have been married 5 years. Ursula suggested wryly, and he chuckled. Perhaps, he agreed with her, though perhaps 10 years would be a safer wager. It was Ursula's turn to laugh at that. A real hearty and warm laugh. Oddly, Robb hadn't expected it to sound that way. Perhaps because he had always assumed her a double of her mother, and there was never a time when he could imagine Cersei Lannister laughing. Not warmly, at any rate. "Here we are," Robb said as they rounded into the corner of the grounds where the Glass Gardens stood. "They are heated like the keep?" Ursula inquired, and he nodded in confirmation. "But made of glass to allow what little sunlight there is to aid growth," she continued, and he nodded again. "You seem well educated in our winter survival," Robb noted as they approached the door to the Glass Gardens. "I have a vested interest," she responded, and he smiled, pulling open the door and gesturing for her to enter before him. "True enough," he agreed with her, following her inside and closing the door firmly behind them. "Gods, it is even warmer than I expected in here," she commented, moving her hands up to undo the clasps of her cloak. "Here, let me." Robb held his hand out to take her discarded garment. "Thank you," "Your Grace," she said as he took it and draped it over his arm. "You're welcome," he smiled for her, realizing that it came easier now each time that he did it. She smiled back before she turned away from him to begin ambling along one of the rows, stopping every now and again to examine one of the plants. "Is this only for the keep?" she finally asked him, and he nodded his head before elaborating his answer. "Seeds are sown at different times, so the produce will be ripe at different times. There is usually a little too much of something or other, that is sent down to the market in Wintertown. Though, the last winter was so hard that we gave whatever we didn't absolutely need away," Rob explained to her, and she nodded slowly. "It must have been difficult, not being on the coast," she commented, and he smiled slightly. "Indeed, having a settlement by the sea can be of great benefit in winter. Our only trade can come by road, and when the snows fall thickest it is impossible to get anywhere," he said. "That is why we Starks have had to come up with our own methods of survival." "Well, you appear to be doing a marvelous job so far," she said in a slightly teasing tone. Rob chuckled, and she smiled back at him, meeting his eyes for a moment before she moved to the end of the row and found the rough-cut stone bench that lay there. She sat herself down and arranged her skirts, Rob watching for a moment before he hesitantly moved towards her. Vaguely he wondered if there would ever come a time when they would do things with one another without hesitating. It had been Ursula before, uncertain of taking his arm, and now it was him, unsure whether or not he should sit himself at her side. He shook his head and moved even closer, draping her cloak over the back of the bench before he straightened his doublet. He slowly sat himself next to her, ensuring that his leg didn't brush against hers as he did so, his eyes finding her hands delicately folded in her lap. Suddenly he was very aware of his own hands, and wondering what to do with them. She spoke up before he could ponder it too much. "Did you mean what you said the other day?" she asked him, her voice quiet and almost fearful. He frowned slightly, wondering which conversation she was referring to. "I don't," he started, but she seemed to sense his confusion, elaborating on her initial question before he could go on. "What you said about our children. Do you really think you wouldn't be able to love them?" she asked, just as quietly. He sighed heavily, afraid to turn his head to the side so he could look at her. "Perhaps," he said, hearing her sharp intake of breath. "But not because of you," he continued, not only because of you. I said what I did out of anger and spite, but the fear inside me is real. It is just not all you're doing, as I said it was." "What then?" Ursula asked him softly, and he took a deep breath. "For over 3 years I fought in wars. Battle after battle. I came up against men, dragons, even the dead. Countless lives have been lost at my sword. I have killed so many. I have watched so many die," he cut off, shaking his head. Ursula said nothing, clearly sensing that he had not finished. "In the end I felt nothing," he went on. "In the end it became normal. It was nothing, the way it would feel to sink a sword into a man. Dying screams. How it sounded when a man choked on his own blood. It was nothing. It washed over me like water. When it first started I felt it when I ended someone's life. I felt something, remorse perhaps," he shrugged. "I don't know exactly, but it was something. I had compassion, it would keep me awake at night and torment me. Did those men have wives, children? Someone waiting for them at home, someone who would miss them? I don't know when I stopped caring, but I did." "I don't believe that," Ursula said quietly after a long moment of silence, and he turned his head to contemplate her. "That you don't care," she elaborated as their eyes met. "You started a war all those years ago because you care. You signed that treaty with my grandfather because you care more for your men and your people than you do for your own happiness. In the end, you fought death itself. Those things you battled were not real, not anymore. Perhaps you stopped caring then because there was nothing left in them to care about. Death to them, real, final death, was a mercy. A relief. You sent them back to the gods they were stolen from and allowed their souls to rest easy again. I will never believe that you don't care, not when I can see what your family means to you. What your people mean to you. You really believe that, don't you?" He smiled slightly wryly at her and she blinked slowly, her eyes huge on his. "How can I not?" she shrugged her shoulder. "If the gods bless us with children I have no doubt that you will love them." She kept her eyes on his. "I know you would have preferred them to have a different mother, but they may well be the best of us both. And no matter what, they will be Starks, they will be yours just as much as they are mine. I know what you think of the Lannister blood, and I know that will not change but our children will be your family, and I know how much you love your family. I should never have blamed you for how I feel inside, Robb told her honestly, and she smiled slightly. Neither can you deny that I am part of the problem, she said, arching one of her brows. You are far less of a problem than I imagined you to be, he replied, and she laughed lightly. That is high praise indeed, Your Grace, she said, and he could feel a slight blush on his cheeks. I didn't mean it to sound like that, he said awkwardly. Forgive me, Princess. I am no Southern knight, I do not have a pretty way with words. I would rather hear honest words from you than pretty false ones, Myrcella said. Do not worry about offending me, Your Grace. I have lived at the capital all my life. You do not survive there unless you learn not to be affected by something as simple as words. Robb smiled slightly at that, considering her for a long moment. Some words can cut more deeply than the sharpest sword. I shouldn't have spoken the way I did the other day. I confess I only uttered them because I was angry with myself. Angry because you were nothing like my imagination told me you would be, and for some inexplicable reason I wanted you to be, he confessed to her, feeling a weight lifted from him as the words left his mouth. A monster, you mean? She arched that brow again, and he nodded. He confirmed. I thought you would despise me. I was well prepared for it, Myrcella said lightly, and he smiled wryly. I thought I would despise you too. He didn't see the point in lying to her about it. And yet here I find myself sat with you, enjoying your company, he continued, smiling at her. It's almost as though we're friends, she smiled back at him. Perhaps that would be a good place to start, he said, and she nodded her head slowly. A very good place, she agreed with him. Hesitantly Robb reached out for her hand, and she slowly moved her own to place in his. He wrapped his fingers over so they covered the back of her hand, and she did the same, her soft fingertips whispering against his skin. Since we are friends, I think you ought to stop addressing me so formally, he smiled, and she returned it, nodding her head slightly. Without thinking he squeezed her hand a little more tightly, realizing that he liked the feel of her skin on his. It was soft and warm and delicate, everything that he had tried to convince himself that she would never be. When he had imagined her, he had always imagined her mother. Poised and cold and unfeeling. Myrcella was poised, that he could not deny, but she was also warm, and from what he had observed and heard from her so far, she was far from unfeeling. Guilt nagged at his stomach, and he wished he could be a little braver and explain everything to her properly. Somehow he knew that she wouldn't judge him for his feelings. She seemed to understand everything far better than he had any right to expect her to. Her expectations had been as low as his own, and yet now they were sat contentedly a mere inch apart with their hands clasped in one another's. It was hardly burning, unyielding passion, but it was a start. A far better start than Robb had ever anticipated. Friendship. What better way to start than establishing that? He could get to know her better, ask her questions, and he would encourage her to do the same to him. Tentatively he stroked his thumb over the back of her hand, his eyes seeking out hers as he did so. I am sorry that I misjudged you, Myrcella, he said sincerely. It wasn't all that he wanted to say, but it would have to do for now. She seemed to understand, her eyes soft on his as she smiled slightly. You're forgiven, Robb. Chapter 8, 7, Sharper Than Swords. Notes. Thank you all so much for the kudos, much appreciated. Also, thank you to Ms. Moon21 for the comment. Yes, they are trying and both realizing that the other isn't as scary as they probably first imagined. They still have progress to make, but they are getting there. Glad you're enjoying the pairing, and I hope you enjoy the update. Happy smiley. Chapter text. Myrcella. When Myrcella woke, she lay still in bed for a long while, just reassuring herself that the events of the previous day had actually happened. Robb, as she had been encouraged to call him now, had been ever so courteous and polite to her. And honest. It was the honesty that she appreciated more than anything else, the truth coming from him easily because she had asked him for it. He had not tried to coddle her or make excuses, he had just told her everything honestly, and that meant more than 1,000 pretty words ever could. Another lady, she imagined, would have preferred a reassuring lie, but not her. She wanted the truth, even if it hurt, and she could not deny that his innermost feelings and fears about their potential children stung. She couldn't blame him. Joffrey had been a monster, why would he want a child of his to share that blood? It was just her misfortune that he had been her brother, that they had shared a mother and a father. Even dead he was still managing to make her life as difficult as possible. She shoved the furs away from her, determined that she would not continue thinking of Joffrey. He had been cold for years, she was not going to let him continue his torment after all this time. She was determined just to think of Robb and his family. Already she seemed to have made good progress with Bran and Lady Stark, and she and Sansa had always had an understanding. Rickon seemed shy, though he had managed to smile tentatively at her on a few occasions. It was Arya who was the problem. It was quite clear that she did not like Myrcella one bit, and she was unsure how she was supposed to convince Robb's sister otherwise. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that if Arya saw that she was getting along better with Robb then she herself might thaw. Alas, it appeared to have done the opposite. Arya had glowered all through dinner after Robb had changed the seating arrangements so Myrcella was sat to his right. Lady Stark had been happy to move down a space, and Myrcella had been quietly thrilled when Robb had pulled out her chair for her. They had spent the evening in contented conversation with one another, speaking of nothing of much importance. Myrcella couldn't help but think that the occasion had been soured for her somewhat by Arya's attitude, however. Each time Myrcella saw her in her line of sight she was scowling, and whenever she and Robb shared a laugh with one another her expression turned murderous. Robb had told her quietly not to let it bother her, but Myrcella couldn't help it. Was she supposed to just ignore it forever? It was not as though she had asked to come here, she was just making the best of the situation that had been thrust upon her. Myrcella knew well enough that each and every one of the Starks had reason to despise her or her family, but if the others were willing to make an effort then why wouldn't Arya? She huffed in irritation, lacing up the bodice of her dress before snatching up her brush from the vanity, pulling it through her hair furiously. Today she would not stand for it, somehow she would have to show Arya that she was not the monster she most likely imagined her to be. Robb had seen it, and by his own admission he was stubborn. Though, by his own admission, Arya was even worse. Myrcella sighed heavily and decided not to dwell on it, placing her brush back down on the vanity before snatching up her stole and heading for the door. Down the hallways she went, making her way to the main stairs that would take her down towards the dining hall. She had learned all the main routes around the keep by now, several of them she must have remembered because she had just instinctively known where to go. Robb had only had to steer her right a few times the day before when he had been showing her around everywhere. The only place they hadn't gone was the crypts. Myrcella had asked him if he would prefer for her not to go down there. He had told her that she was welcome to go wherever she pleased, but that he himself did not have the stomach to enter the crypts. From that she knew that he was still mourning the loss of his father, he didn't need to say it. It was obvious. Just as his mother's choice of black clothing was obvious. The loss here was still real, even after all the years that had passed. Into the dining hall she went, her eyes immediately going to scan the high table. It was empty aside from Sansa and her husband. They were sat at one end of it, their elder daughter sat in Sir Oliver's lap as Sansa leant in towards them and fussed over her. Myrcella imagined that baby Rhaegar must be with her nurse. She was loath to disturb what was evidently a private family breakfast, but her stomach was snarling with hunger. Slowly she made her way up to the high table, intending to sit on the opposite end to Sansa and her family. Her future good sister looked up as she came closer though, sending her a wide smile. "Myrcella, come and join us," she said warmly. "I do not think you have yet met Oliver, and I know you haven't met Bethany." "Thank you. I hope I'm not disturbing you," Myrcella replied, glancing towards Sir Oliver and seeing that he was wearing a relaxed smile. "Of course not." Sansa shook her head at once, and Myrcella moved to take the empty seat next to her. "Can I pour you some wine, princess?" Sir Oliver enquired, and Myrcella smiled. "Thank you, sir," she responded, and he smiled back, moving to pour her a glass. Little Bethany in his lap leaned forwards to try and snatch at the flagon as he moved it back down to settle on the table, a determined grunt leaving her. "You are a little too young for wine, my dear," Sir Oliver said in an amused tone, settling the flagon well out of her reach. "She is into absolutely everything at the moment," Sansa said exasperatedly, but Myrcella didn't miss the affection underlying her tones. "She's utterly beautiful," Myrcella told her honestly, and Sansa seemed to glow at the compliment. Ursula shifted slightly in her seat so she could fill her plate with breakfast, smiling slightly as Bethany began to babble away. If she strained her ears she could decipher at least every other word. Sansa and her husband seemed to understand her perfectly though, both chattering happily back to her. Ursula was so pleased to see for herself how happy Sansa was. It had been after the dragons had come and were defeated that news had come that Sansa had been married to Robb's old squire. The match had placated the phrase somewhat, it was some consolation for them that they were once again married into royalty. Of course, they had desired a free woman in Ursula's place, but her grandfather had flooded the twins with gold to make old Walder relinquish his desire for a free queen. Ursula had wondered, all those years ago, whether Sansa's match was a love match or if it were a political one. Robb was also king in the Riverlands of course, and he would have to maintain good relations with them. Marrying his sister into one of the most prominent families would certainly do that. Seeing them together though, Ursula suspected that it was not a political decision. There was clear love between them. She could see it in the way they looked at one another, the way they spoke to one another, and in the way they were with their daughter. She smiled slightly and began on her breakfast. If anyone deserved to marry for love it was Sansa. She vaguely wondered if the older woman had ever told her family the extent to which Joffrey made her suffer at the capital, if she had confided it to them, or perhaps to her husband. Ursula hoped that she had confided in someone, it did no good to keep such things hidden inside. She knew that well enough. A letter came for you today. Sansa's voice pulled her away from her thoughts and away from her breakfast. For me? Ursula repeated, wondering who would have written. Tommen. Her mother. She had sent word of her safe arrival when she had settled in on that first day. It seemed that someone had decided to reply to her after all. Robb took it. Sansa told her, he said he would make sure you got it, in case no one was here when you came down to break your fast. How thoughtful of him. Ursula smiled slightly, ashamed at the slight feeling of uneasiness that crept into her stomach. Of course Robb would give her the letter, he would not have told everyone that he would otherwise, would he? They had agreed yesterday that it was always best to be truthful with one another. She bit her lip, wondering if he would read the letter. Surely he wouldn't. She would know if he had anyway, he would have to break the seal, and there was no way that he could reseal it without her noticing. She shook her head slightly. It did no good to have suspicions like this. Suspicions like this belonged in the capital, not up here in the north. This was an honest country, she knew that just as well as she knew that the grass grew green. It was foolish to think otherwise. She would see Robb later and he would give her the letter, and that would be the end of that. Ursula had done her best to find Robb, without actually telling anyone that she was looking for him. It was to no avail though, he was in none of the public places that she could go, and if she went to his study or to the council chambers then he would know that she was looking for him. Eventually she gave up, deciding that he would find her whenever he had a free moment. It was easy sometimes to forget that he was a king, and she knew well enough that he would have extra responsibilities now that winter was on the way again. She sighed as she made her way outside, her eyes finding one of the direwolves. It was the black one, Rookins if she remembered rightly. She had yet to meet any of the others and it had confused her. Lady Stark told her that Robb had kept them away from her sight on purpose, in case she were averse to them. While Ursula was touched at the thoughtfulness, she did want to tell him that there was no need. Everyone knew the tales. Robb and his own wolf, Grey Wind, had been nigh on inseparable throughout the war. He had gone into battle with the beast at his side, and had it not been for the wolf's interjection then that dragon may well have finished him off. Ursula shuddered involuntarily at the thought, refusing to dwell on why. That thought would only lead to more confusion, and her head was already full of 1,001 contradicting thoughts. If I care for him, will I be betraying my family? She shook her head, forcing the thought away as she came to a halt by the flickering lamps that stood on either side of the entrance to the crypt. Robb had said she was welcome to enter them, but she was still wary, casting a nervous look about her before taking a breath and slipping inside. The light was dim, and for a moment she was blind until she blinked everything slowly back into focus. It was cold here, and the air seemed heavy. When she took a breath it all smelled damp and musty. There was a steady drip of water that calmed her nerves somewhat as she took the steps down one at a time. When she reached the even ground again she glanced ahead of her. Alcoves lined the walls, each one with a flickering lamp lit above it and an effigy placed atop the stone slab. The first of them workings from long ago, before the dragons had come the first time. Mercilla's footsteps echoed ominously as she walked further, going past king after king until she came upon Torren. The king who kneeled. She could hardly blame him. She had seen the skulls of the first dragons, it was not hard to imagine the bodies that had come with them. The wings. The fire. She shuddered again and walked away from Torren. Now came lord after lord. She walked slowly, inspecting their carved effigies. Even though they were made of stone, she could see the familiarity between them. She could tell that they had all been kin. When she came upon Lord Ricard Stark, she paused, knowing who would be coming next. She took a breath, appreciating now why Robb had not wanted to show her this place. It was bad enough for her, and she had barely known Lord Stark. She forced her feet onwards, having come this far she wanted to reach the end, to pay her respects whether they would be appreciated or not. She walked slowly past Brandon Stark and Lyanna Stark, remembering that Robb's father had broken tradition by having them buried here in the crypts. Then he himself came, the engraving more freshly carved and easy to read than the others had been. Mercilla looked up at the effigy, smiling slightly as she saw how well his likeness had been carved. It was fine stonework, whoever had crafted it was obviously skilled indeed. Her fingers went to trace the words, wondering vaguely if they had been chipped into the stone by the same man. "Don't you dare touch that!" The voice was low and threatening, and Mercilla moved her hand away at once. She swallowed hard and turned away from Lord Stark's resting place to find herself face to face with his younger daughter. "Forgive me," she said at once, "I meant no offense, my lady." "What are you doing here?" Arya's voice was at once scathing and suspicious, and Mercilla knew that she would likely not be leaving this place on friendly terms with her. She could try though, surely. There could be no harm in trying. "I was just paying my respects." Robb said it would be all right, Mercilla answered her, knowing at once that it was not what Arya had wanted to hear. Her grey eyes had flashed almost dangerously when she had uttered Robb's name. "What do you know about respect, Lannister?" Arya practically spat the word, and Mercilla had to force herself not to flinch away from her. "I know what my family has been guilty of, but I had no part in it, Arya. You cannot think that I could condone." "Save your false courtesies," Arya cut across her. "You may have my mother and the rest of them fooled, but you don't fool me. Whatever game you have come here to play, I will scupper it, you mark my words." Mercilla frowned, hearing the threat in her tone but also something underlying it that sounded almost fearful. "Game?" Mercilla repeated, her frown sinking deeper into her forehead. "Don't play innocent," Arya scoffed. "Joffrey did the same when you were here last, wrapping Sansa up in his charm and twisting her around his fingers. I can see you doing the same to Robb, and I won't let you do to him what Joffrey did to Sansa." "Joffrey was a monster," Mercilla snapped. "He may have been my brother, but I am nothing like him. Believe me, my lady, no one knows better than I what Joffrey did to Sansa. I was there, remember, I was with her at the capital the entire time. I saw things no child should see, and I would no doubt have seen a whole lot more if Joffrey hadn't died when he did. You are not the only people who have suffered at his hands. No one was safe. Not even his own family." With that, Mercilla made to move past Arya so she could leave the crypt, but her wrist was snatched almost painfully to stop her leaving. She wrenched it from Arya's grip and stared at her. "Just stay away from here, let my father rest in peace," Arya told her menacingly. "I am not the enemy, Arya," Mercilla implored her. "Your father was always very kind to me. I know you won't believe me, but I did not rejoice nor revel in his death. I was a child who had just lost her own father." "Oh please," Arya scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Everyone in Westeros knows that your father is still well and truly alive." Mercilla stared at that. She could do nothing else. She had heard the whispers and seen the looks. She wasn't stupid, she knew what they said about her mother and her Uncle Jaime. Her nails dug hard into the palms of her hands as she clenched her fists tightly. Never had she thought that it would be thrown at her by a member of the Stark family. She had expected gossip from the servants, whispers and giggles hidden behind hands. That she could have dealt with. This. She shook her head slightly and turned on her heel, marching back through the crypts with her heart pounding in her ears. Her eyes were stinging when she emerged back into daylight, a combination of her rising emotion and the sudden brightness of the outside world. She took deep breaths, determining to calm herself down as she slowly unclenched her fists. Her palms were stinging and she looked down vaguely, seeing that she had drawn blood from a few of the little crescents set into her skin. The pain was nothing though, just a vague sting that dulled into nothingness when compared to how hard Arya's words had hit her. Had she said it out of spite? Or was that what they all secretly thought? What Rob thought? She squeezed her eyes tightly shut as tears threatened to spill from her, counting to 10 over and over in her head. Close your eyes and cover your ears, count to 10 slowly in your head and it will be over, Tommen. I promise you. It had always calmed her brother, but it was not working for her now as Arya's words resounded more and more loudly inside her head. A hand on her shoulder almost made her jump out of her skin, and she turned quickly, her eyes wide and shining. Myrcella. Rob's voice was laced with concern and it was almost enough for her to surrender to the tears. She wondered if he would comfort her, if he would go so far as to put his arms around her. Her eyes took in the vastness of him. He was not the tallest man but he had over a head on her, but what he lacked in height he made up for in bulk. It was muscle, she knew, not fat the way her father always denied he was. Her father. Just thinking that made her want to break down and cry. Rob's hand came under her chin and she flinched slightly without meaning to. You have a pretty enough face now, but do you imagine any man wanting a scarred bride? She shuddered, blinking away the flash of silver. Myrcella, has something happened? Has someone hurt you? Rob's tone was soft but insistent and she shook her head automatically. Her eyes found Arya emerging from the crypts and she swallowed hard, averting them back to Rob and hoping that he hadn't noticed her momentary distraction. She ought to have known that he would have, he seemed incredibly astute at times. This appeared to be one of those times. He turned to look over his shoulder, doubtless seeing Arya disappearing around the corner. What did she say to you? He asked her in a slightly exasperated manner when he turned back to face her. Myrcella swallowed, wondering how honest she should be with him. If she told him the whole truth then she would be bringing up the unspoken subject of the rumors of her parentage. She wasn't sure she was ready for that yet, but on the other hand, she couldn't ignore it forever. It was already nagging at her now that Arya had broached the subject, and she was desperate to know what Rob thought of it. I went down to the crypts, Myrcella answered him. I explained that you had given me leave but I suppose it was just my bad luck that she came across me as I reached where your father rests. Understanding crossed Rob's features, and for a moment it looked as though he wanted to step closer to her. He stood his ground though, and Myrcella knew that it was very wrong of her to have wanted him closer. She swallowed, remembering the warmth of his hand and thinking about how easily she would be lost in his embrace. Hear me now, you must never, ever show him any weakness. No tears. No affection. What if her mother was wrong? It was no secret that her marriage was an unhappy one. Myrcella had even heard some rather disturbing rumors that she had engineered her father's accident. She pushed it away. It did no good to think of things like that. Not now. Not now when she needed to focus on Rob. I can well imagine, he said sympathetically, and she smiled weakly for him. I'm not sure it ended me to her, but I'm fine, I promise you. She tried to sound reassuring. My first lie to him, and we are not even wed yet. I can tell you don't want to tell me everything, he said knowingly, and I won't push you on it, but don't promise me. Don't lie. And he sees right through it. Through me. She mentioned my mother, and my uncle, she blurted out before she could stop herself, and Rob's eyes widened. I've heard the rumors, heard them whispered 1,000 times, Myrcella continued, unable to stop now. I don't know what the truth is, I only know what I have always been told. Robert Baratheon was my father, though I know well enough I favor my mother. I don't. She paused to take a deep breath. I don't know what is true and what is not, and it matters not to me either way. I would rather live in ignorance where this is concerned, but you, how does it make you feel? Rob stared at her intently for a long moment, and she could feel her hands begin to shake. Before she could clench them together to stop them, he had taken them in his own. A frown creased his brow, and before she could snatch her hands away from him, he had turned them over to inspect her palms. She swallowed hard as he raised his eyes from the marks to her eyes. You did this to yourself. He shook his head slightly. Why? He asked, the simple question setting her bottom lip trembling. It's just, she shook her own head, trying to find the right words. I used to try and keep Tommen from Joffrey. Joffrey was terrible to him. More terrible than he ever was to me, because he knew that Tommen would never fight back, she explained. So I had to fight back for him, to stand between them and shield him. I don't, Robb tailed off, shaking his head, and Myrcella knew that he didn't understand. I wasn't as fearless as I pretended to be, she met his eyes, only, I had to be or Joffrey would have just brushed me aside, or worse. If I didn't do this, she flexed her fingers to show him what she meant, then my whole body would shake. It's an instinct. A habit I haven't been able to break. Whenever I'm scared, or whenever I feel my composure slipping, I do it. It's a reflex, I can't help it. I don't usually draw blood, but, she trailed off, averting her eyes. But what Arya said really upset you, he finished for her, and she forced herself to meet his eyes again. Part of me wanted to lash out, she confessed. She didn't seem to be able to help herself when she looked into his eyes. They made her want to confess all of her long-buried secrets when she met them. Believe me, Robb smiled slightly, you are neither